When you think of landmark games, the ones that shape the industry, what are some of the first things that come to your mind? Doom, for its love of all things heavy metal and for laying the ground rules for all future FPS titles to come? What about something like Call of Duty 4, which helped pioneer the market for the AAA linear shooter? How about Dark Souls for its integration of background storytelling and reaction-based combat? We can all argue which game for which genre, but which game is the granddaddy of psychological horror? You can try your hardest, but it's damn near impossible to find a list that doesn't have this game on the top or close to it. Silent Hill 2. But why is that? What makes this game so compelling even after all these years? Why do people hold this game so high, above not only other horror titles like Dead Space, Resident Evil, and Fear, but over other games in the Silent Hill series itself? Well, I think it's not an easy answer, and much like the nature of Silent Hill 2 itself, the answer lies deep in the bowels of one's own mind, and you have to come to your own conclusions. Sit back, relax, and let's dig deep into this beloved classic in the only way I know how, with the mind and a healthy amount of coffee. Silent Hill 2, despite its name, is a rather unique game, and that I feel pretty much anyone with no prior knowledge of the first game or the future titles can jump straight into it and not feel like they're missing out on something crucial. The closest sequel to Silent Hill 1 was actually 3, and pretty much every game outside of those two has a self-contained story, which makes looking at Silent Hill 2 in a vacuum both a blessing and a curse. Like I said earlier, this game is the game in the series that fans generally suggest to people, and talk about the most, but the drawback of that logic is the other titles receive less attention and deeper analysis. Yet, as someone who studied this game like a religion for over a decade, well, I can see why. What makes Silent Hill 2, to me, so much of a standout is its incredibly dense atmosphere, well-constructed environments, and the fact it's a game that's not afraid to dip its toes into subject matter that's generally considered heavy. Sexual repression, losing a spouse, suicide, and the sheer horror of our own minds. Shit, it's hard to find any media now that can have the stones to even mention these topics or handle them gracefully. Maybe it's because the average person just can't stomach the reality of the world we live in. I don't know. I've mentioned numerous times in my LPs and various conversations in real life, I find it funny that at least in America we're more comfortable with someone saying they're gay or trans, but lack the social ability to handle the idea that someone might be a Luciferian Satanist or a deep-seated nihilist. Everything we see, everything we say, and everything we do generally stems from a place of, well, for lack of a better term, normalcy. People are more inclined to enjoy stories about the hero saving the day, or the cool sports dudes winning the tournament, or the underdog overcoming something. But that's not how the real world works, and that's something Silent Hill 2 does exceptionally well, even after all these years. I admit SH2 is the only game in the series I've completed as a player and not observer, but I have at least a foot in the door from various friends, YouTube channels, and word of mouth. But from what I understand, the general consensus is that the other games in the series don't have the same care put into them that SH2 has, whether it be the environments, the characters, or the overall way the games play. Like I said, I can't comment for games I haven't played in terms of a deeper analysis, but as an observer, sadly, I feel like I could just be content having played Silent Hill 2. I feel any game, film, or piece of music should be able to hold itself up alone, and in a vacuum, because to me that shows there's a level of quality that was put into something. It's why, as a massive fan of the group Korn, I'm okay with having a discussion with people and they say, I only really like Follow the Leader. I don't just scream, fuck you, Untouchables is their best album, and you only like that album because John makes the funny noises in Freak on a Leash. Because shockingly, we all like different things. I think South of Heaven is a better album than Rain and Blood. Fight me.
This is Woodstock, goddammit!
I don't know. Maybe The Room is the real best game in the Silent Hill series? Who knows? Your opinions and mileage may vary, but for me, I think the experiences of SH2 is so hard to match because it sets so many standards for the series moving forward. An imposing antagonistic boss-like creature, otherworld fog world shifts that break up sections of the game, abstract and unsettling imagery that gets more insane as the game progresses, enemies based on fear and uncertainty. You get the idea. I'm well aware the first Silent Hill game had some of these mechanics, but I've not played it, and as much as it pains me to say this, I feel the PS1, despite being one of my favorite consoles of all time, really couldn't convey the themes that Silent Hill 2 had. I mean, hell, just think of how hard the first Silent Hill pushed the PS1. You couldn't even come close to being able to nail things like the facial animations, lighting, or even the sheer amount of audio this game has. I'm going to try and move forward with the idea of experiencing Silent Hill 2 as it is, with as little acknowledgement of other titles in the series, so let's keep going. I'd also like to point out, if you want to, I don't mind if you lower the video and do something else. I'm going to be trying to be as non-visual as humanly possible, because I really want to flex my writing skills here and not my video editing side. All the music you're hearing is also going to be done by me, because, let's face it, you've heard the SH2 tracks a million times, and I want to make this as original as possible. Not to mention, I'm not the first person to talk about some of the topics here, and other YouTubers and fans have laid out most of the groundwork for me, so I really feel like I'm just a drop in the ocean here. If I do a cool job, great. But realize that the greats like Max Darrett will always be much better than me, much more informed, and will always be the true lore keepers of the Silent Hill 2 mythology and franchise. I'm just me. Also, yeah, I'm going to be talking about some heavy subjects. You clicked on a video about an M-rated franchise, and I don't believe in censorship. If we're so progressive as a culture, we should be able to be mature enough to take the kid gloves off and stop using shame tactics for people like me who've experienced many of the themes in this game. I get everyone has a tolerance level and various triggers, but, you know, part of my want as someone diagnosed with MDD, OCPD, and CPTSD is to live in a world where people realize the genuine dangers of walking on eggshells and treating the mentally ill like they're always on the edge. We're just like you, and you can become just like us. It's better to know the ugly truth than to walk on a clean lie, in my opinion. But this is my one and only discretion warning. If this video series ever gets ads on it, cool, but I'm not editing it for the sake of some out-of-touch corporate boomer who wants to sit there with white knuckles gasping at every time I use the fuck word and counting how many possible instances of trigger words I use, like death, kill, sex, or whatever some basement dweller considers offensive in this day and age. Hell, this may shock someone, but I don't care if this video gets 5 views or 5 million because I just wanted to make something for fun. I'm an ex-drama and art student as well as a writer and a musician, so this is truly a passion project for me, and my goal is to contribute my interpretations on the Silent Hill 2 experience. If this series blows up, cool, but I may make other projects similar to this one in the future, but don't hold your breath. I mean, by all means, look at other creators, explore, and come to your own conclusions and opinions. That's what makes art so engaging, and why this video series exists. So, let's get started. So let's get this all out of our systems before I keep moving forward. Silent Hill 2 is not some sort of crazy transcended media form that you need to use your big brain to understand. It's a video game. You push buttons, things happen, and the game ends with a stat screen. For God's sake, you can run down the street with a chainsaw, pretend this is a homeless simulator, and imagine the whole game is some sort of crazy, really bad acid trip, which I'm not gonna stop you. SH2, despite the fact that it's a game, I personally feel is better suited as a game over a film or a novel, and that's why I love games so much as a medium. The player feels tensions when their health or ammo is low, the player can miss certain things because they didn't poke their head into certain areas, and most importantly to me at least, each player, shockingly, plays games differently than the other. If you watch a movie or a show, you're subjected to the writing team and the director and what they want you to see, and very little of your experience can change. It's mainly interpretive, if that makes any sense. It's not like your second time watching Breaking Bad, you suddenly get a scene where Gus Fring kills a dude with a pencil sharpener, or the final scene song changes to Get Low. No, the whole process is structured in a way to compensate for the time crunch of film and TV, and what the director wants you to see. You can't just sit there reading, I don't know, Harry Potter, and all of a sudden you get to decide whether or not Dumbledore kills Snape or Snape kills Dumbledore. No, Snape kills Dumbledore. I'm sorry to spoil this for you. The most a novel can do, and this is also coming from a writer's perspective myself, is to let the reader come to their own conclusions, based on what the writer put on the paper. Maybe you picture Billy Willie the shoe clerk at a bowling alley to look like James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2, but until the writer says explicitly he looked like James Sunderland from Silent Hill 2, you really are subjected to what the writer is capable of presenting based on their own skills and experience. It's also why you can tell the difference between a writer like Dan Brown, who's more of a quick and expedient writer, versus someone like Tolkien, who's more of a set dresser who wants to immerse the reader in the world they're glimpsing. A good writer is only as good as what they know, is what I'm trying to say here. For a video game, however, a player can spend as much or as little time as they want, focusing on the minute details if they want to. Like how there's a vacuum sealed bag of pretzels on a table in Resident Evil 4, or how in Shadow of the Colossus your arrows can get shaken off a Colossus when they shake their body. It's also why I think Silent Hill 2 excels as far as analysis goes, because of the fact the player can choose to engage in what they want, when they want, and how they want. You want to go into every room with a gun in your hand, radio operate a throwdown? Sure, Chief, go right ahead and have at it. You want to turn your flashlight off around enemies because you're not comfortable dodging? Go ahead. This is something games let you do, unlike other media forms, and it's why I personally feel games don't translate to film. Because there's so many small things that make up each individual player's experience with the game that no single playthrough is really alike. Each time I've played SH2, I noticed something different. Like how my first time I played it, I actually missed out on knowing about the awesome bathroom jump scare. Yet, let's not beat around the bush. Silent Hill 2 as a game, it's not graceful. Even for the time this game came out, it still feels kinda stiff and robotic. I get it, it's a staple of survival horror to have kinda weird controls, but sometimes you take dumb damage because the game doesn't have a built-in dodge mechanic, or even the courtesy of a stamina meter. If there's anything to take away from what I'm trying to say, it's that despite Silent Hill 2 being applauded as a genuinely well-written and directed game, it's not something you play because you want to experience one-to-one visceral combat or exploration. It's something you play because you want to experience the atmosphere and story. I think the closest analog I can compare this game to is something akin to maybe a walking simulator like the Stanley Parable, or a cinematic game like the Metal Gear series, because despite all the actual gaminess of Silent Hill 2, the vast majority of it is still cinematic or meant to be engaged with like a cinematic title. The core loop of SH2 is also not very complex because really it boils down to a few things. Enter location, get some story movement, explore said location to find key items and consumables, solve basic puzzles, move story along, repeat. I don't feel it's very different to the direct competitor series Resident Evil, but the emphasis is more on making the player immersed in the world of Silent Hill to get under the player's skin in a slow, methodical way through audio cues, camera movements, and ambiguity. A game like Resident Evil 4 is more focused on the combat rather than the world or character building, and it provides the player with goodies that are designed around the combat loop in mind. You can look at any room in Silent Hill 2 in any section and just about everything is constructed with some sort of message in mind, and that's honestly not to say RE4 doesn't do that as well, but in RE4 you're mainly looking through the environments for treasure items, herbs, or ammo. In SH2, the only pickups are health and ammo, and the camera is framed in rooms to make you, the player, push forward either out of necessity or curiosity. I know, like I said earlier, I'm trying to go into this analysis in a vacuum, but it's inevitable that someone will make the comparisons of Silent Hill and Resident Evil. But while they're fundamentally the same kind of game, they pace and play themselves very differently. It's like saying that Shadow of the Colossus and Dark Souls are the same game just because they have boss fights that are against large creatures. Nah, their mechanics are vastly different and their gameplay loops and philosophies are almost polar opposites. Tangents aside, I think that Silent Hill 2 objectively could only work as a game. I can't see it as a film. Even the soundtrack alone without the context of the game is just a piece of what makes this whole thing click. It's not that if SH2 was a film it would be bad, no, I feel it'd be fine, but the level of engagement that allows for immersion that games are known for, that's what makes Silent Hill 2 work. It's not exactly a fun or well-designed game if we're going on the basis that video games inherently need to be fun or satisfying. I mean, horror, despite being subjective, isn't very fun when you really think about it. The hell kind of person really wants to engage with something that's disgusting, upsetting, or morbid? Well, that depends on the person, really, I guess. There are a lot of theories on why we as a species engage in things like horrific or violent media, but there's no real honest-to-God answer. I've watched pretty much all the mainstream older slasher films because my dad wanted to, and it was a fun thing to do, you know, laugh at how stupid some of it is, but it's hard for me to find deeper meaning in things that are fantastical, because at the end of the day, these films are very commercialized and fun movies. Something like The Silence of the Lambs or Eraserhead is far more interesting to me because it's cryptic, it's unsettling, it's paced well, and there's a lot of things going on the audience doesn't get to see or hear. Maybe you or someone you know has played Silent Hill 2 before and they said, yeah, it's boring, I don't like it, or I just don't get it, it's too obtuse. Hopefully you're able to hold back the urge to go get good, scrub, because remember, we all like different things.
Bullshit!
I personally think that the Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts games are absolutely overrated and pretentious games, and you can't change my mind. But I like their mechanics in terms of combat and gameplay loops. I don't think the people that like those games are dum-dums, because I don't like their anime spaghetti games. I just don't like the presentation. Same goes for my opinions on Mortal Kombat versus Street Fighter. I just prefer certain aesthetics, and as petty as it can sound, I'm very picky when it comes to the properties or things I like. The magic of art and media is our ability to choose and engage with what we find enjoyable or worth our time. And you know, maybe you're one of those people that will watch this whole series front to back 100 times but never touch Silent Hill 2. It's possible. I didn't play the game until 2023, and I'd known about it since the game came out. Yet, all the Let's Plays I've watched, all the wiki articles I read, and all the thought I put into the game and series as a whole over all those years, playing the game was a wholly different experience. I admit it freely, I had just about everything spoiled in this game for me before I played it, and yet playing it, I was still engrossed and enthralled by the experience. There were a lot of moments I didn't know about, like where some of the enemies were, or how to solve the puzzles, and lots of little things you can't see from your computer or phone screen. For example, I didn't know just how much of Silent Hill 2's map was open from the start, honestly, and despite the very handy map and all the knowledge of the story, I was shocked by just how disorienting and sprawling the game was even after my first playthrough. Many areas are locked, yeah, it's a staple of these kind of games, but one of the things I think that Silent Hill as a franchise does very well is conveying to the player what doors are useless and what doors are actually something you'll open up later with a key. Useless fluff doors are marked off on your map with a scribble, and their examine text reads, "It's jammed," or "The lock is broken," where key-triggered doors are marked on your map with flat lines and examine text like, "It's locked," or "I can't open it from this side." It sounds so small, but honestly it's a very handy and useful feature that not only helps the players sort what rooms and areas are useful, but it helps make the player engage with the world by paying attention to their surroundings, which not only makes the game last longer, but it also helps show appreciation to the designers who actually made the game. I mean shit, how many times in a game do you honestly stop and look around at things just for the sake of doing it? If the player is able to mark off and explore areas using some sort of mapping feature, it's likely a player will take the time to engage in side content. It's why games like modern Elder Scrolls, Fallout, and Far Cry titles use map markers and sporadic dungeon design. It helps to keep the player constantly in the loop, exploring for things like crafting materials and combat XP for more casual players who enjoy things quick and simple, and usually adding fluff text and environmental storytelling for the more slower players who like to analyze and break down the world they're in. This design isn't new, and Silent Hill 2 does something similar, with each room in the game almost always containing an enemy, a key item, some environmental detail, a goodie, or some combination of these things. It's not necessary to actually go into every room in the game unless you're going for something like the 10-star rank stats, but the game does accommodate each type of player I can really think of. It must also be said that Silent Hill 2 isn't a particularly hard game. I'd honestly say that SH2 strikes a fine line of being both extremely accessible to pretty much someone like your dad, but also with just enough of a satisfying game feel for someone like your mom. Nothing in the game is ever outright unfair, and exploration is actually pretty straightforward. I don't think I could ever trust my dad with a game like Code Veronica X due to the nature of the crushing combat or the game-breaking puzzle items. SH2's combat is so rudimentary and it gets the job done, you know? You just point your gun or stick and you shoot or beat the ever-loving fuck out of whatever gets in your way until it doesn't decide to get up anymore. Just like in real life. Aside from hard mode, enemies don't take all that much of a beating, and none of them are outright that complicated to fight, but we'll talk about that enemy roster later. Barring a few exceptions, enemies in this game don't really have more than just a simple melee attack based on player proximity. Combat, like I said, is rudimentary, and I mean that in an endearing way. It was never the focus of Silent Hill 2, and it really shows. You'll always have more than enough health and ammo, even if you don't go out of your way to explore all that much. Melee weapons don't break, no matter how many skulls you smack, unlike in a game like Condemn, where the focus of the game is more about the combat and environment constantly changing to suit the player's needs in the situation. There's never any urgency for the player to try and mix up their game all that much. You either shoot or stick enemies, but because of the wonky controls, I'd say that it's better to stick to a firearm, mainly just to expedite the combat and move on. The main focus of SH2 from a gameplay perspective is to solve puzzles to move from one area of the game to the next. Despite the rather open-seeming game world, you really are generally following a linear path, and the design of the areas you explored tends to have some sort of shortcut or natural landmark to indicate where you should be and where you've already been. Like I said, the map is a super handy feature, and it feels natural that James marks where things are at, like locked doors and puzzle areas. Speaking of puzzles, the puzzles of SH2 are adequate. On the normal puzzle difficulty, they're fairly straightforward, with things like place the doodads to make the man scream, or find the toilet wallet to get a locker combo. None of the key items are fairly cryptic or that hard to find, thankfully, and James does have a nice feature where he moves his gaze to look at things you can pick up, so you're fairly safe from accidentally missing something you actually need to progress the game, and quite a few things are actually pointed out in cutscenes at various points. Of course, there are some pretty obtuse solutions to things. One of the most egregious examples being the fact you need to grab a case of juice you find in one half of the apartment complex section, use it to push a trash bag down a garbage chute at the other complex section to get a coin that spills out of the trash on the ground level outside the area where you just started. Fuck me, there's more steps to this puzzle than there is for me to get the mail every day, but it's not the worst thing ever. It's honestly better than classic Resident Evil, where you had to balance both your combat and puzzle items at all times. The game never actually makes you interact or combine too many items at once, and all your consumables actually stack infinitely, so there's never a worry about having too much or too little when it comes to preparation for certain places. Like I said earlier, the core mechanics of this game are actually very accessible. I think that this sort of laid-back approach to things is also what makes SH2 so easy to recommend to people who don't even like video games. Like your dad, who you should call right now and have him play the game. The only time SH2 really does get kinda gross and yucky is mainly if you put the game on the highest difficulty, and yeah, I mean shit, it's as hard as it gets, what do you expect, right? But at the same time, you really start to feel why the game doesn't excel at satisfying or engaging combat. It takes ages to kill enemies, and their increased speed and aggression just makes it so that you're almost always forced into fighting them, and it gets really fucking messy, especially on what are otherwise normally interesting moments. I mean, Christ, the hallway chase scene is the definition of trial and error on hard, and the awkwardness of fighting the enemies like the nurses is just fucking awful. You can say, well, don't put the game on hard, dum-dum, and you know what? Fuck you, you're right. But you have to remember, some people like me enjoy a challenge in a game, and I have a design philosophy that a good game can flex all of its mechanics on the highest or lowest difficulty if it's designed properly. This game, well, not so much. To me, it's baffling why things like the boat section have unique controls based on the difficulty, or the fact you can run into walls if you're not careful in hard mode. I'm not saying it's bad either, it's actually kind of interesting to me, but I feel like if these options were there from the get-go, it would have made playing the game in hard mode a little bit more tolerable. After all, how many people even know these differences are there, aside from the obvious things of a hard mode like more enemy health and damage output? Also, speaking of difficulty and differences, I love how as you play SH2 into a New Game Plus cycle, new endings and items open up. I think this is a wonderful way of adding replay value and increasing the player's interest to keep looking for new things. I mean, yeah, you can say it's padding, but remember the time that this game came out. The internet wasn't as widely usable as it is now, so imagine if you're playing this game without prior knowledge and on a repeat playthrough, you notice something like the Rebirth ending items. Naturally, this is a great way for players to look more into the game and see just how much blood they can squeeze from the stone. I mean, yeah, now people have data mined this game and scrutinized every texture, audio file, and possible lore detail, but there are still little things people notice about SH2 to this day, and they probably will forever because it's just an interesting game. I mean, shit, it blew my mind to even know there was the See My Dead Wife audio trigger that can happen in room 209. Like, your game seed can just not have that. I didn't hear it until I think my third playthrough, and yeah, it does turn out that the sound was actually just a stock whisper sound effect, But imagine this was 2001. It just feels so modern, if that makes any sense. You know, if your friend said, "Hey man, what do you think about the whispering in room 209?" and you said, "Huh? The fuck you talking about, dude? You been up watching the MTVs too late again?" It would naturally pique your curiosity and you might actually check it out to see if they were just pulling your leg. I mean, hell, as a kid, before the internet, games were pretty damn mystical to not just me, but many others. Things like rumors would spread a lot, like Bigfoot in San Andreas, the Mew under the truck rumor in Pokemon, or inflating the tits on the hoverboard alien in Ratchet and... oh. Well, you get my point. I guess what I'm trying to say is Silent Hill 2 on a purely game level may not be remarkable, but because of the fact it's a game, it gives players so much more than any other media can. I'm not interested in the design process and history of SH2, like, yeah, it's cool, but you know, development and final product are two different things. We don't actually play as Akira Yamaoka grinding pipes together or Masahiro Ito drawing vagina monsters, okay? We play the game we got as a collaborative effort of those wonderful designers at Team Silent, and it is what it is. A product of passion, and it clearly shows. This is something that actually bothers me, and maybe it's because I have OCPD, but go nowhere statements like, "Oh, this movie had a budget of $10,000 and earned $200,000, or, "Oh, we were gonna originally cast Sam Jackson to voice James Sunderland."
What? You must be joking.
Say what again? I dare you. I double dare you, motherfucker. Say what one more goddamn time.
Like, from a realistic standpoint, it honestly doesn't matter. Maybe I'm too much of an in-the-now kind of guy and too cynical, but if someone told me, you know, Silent Hill 2 didn't launch to great critical acclaim at first, my first response is, cool, I don't care, form your own opinion. I don't believe in that ass-backwards archaic, "you're entitled to your opinion" statement because it's pointless what other people actually think of what you like, personally. If your opinion is changed by others, that's not bad too. It's pretty normal for people to change their taste over time. I used to just like SH2 because it was creepy looking and had the guy with the big knife who wore geometry homework on his head. I actually used to think that the people who liked this game were pretentious and the fans looked way too deep into it. Bit of a coincidence now, I guess. However, my opinions of this game obviously grew and adapted as I matured. And as I looked deeper and deeper and deeper, I realized something. It wasn't the game aspect of Silent Hill 2 that people adored, it was the story, and how much of that I personally resonated with. And that was what made me realize there's a reason this game is a landmark, and nothing else can topple it. Thanks for watching so far, and I'll see you in the next one. So we've looked at the game of the video game that I'm talking about. Now let's dissect the video of said game. It's probably hypocritical of me to even say I hate video games that try to be cinematic or anything more than I pulled the man's head off, but at least to me, I feel video games offer something that a movie or TV show just kinda can't pull off. Like a man's head. And that's context and drive. It's not often that a game can straddle that fine line anymore, especially in this day and age of ultra overproduced walking simulators and ultra overproduced walking simulators with automatic weaponry. It's maybe a product of my upbringing, having been born in 1994, that to me, cinematics in games were special. I grew up with the Sega Genesis and games like Flashback, Sonic 2, and PGA European Tour that were essentially some of the only games I owned that told most of their story through non-verbal gestures and small bits of text. No, seriously, PET is the tight canon, trust me. As I got older and got a hold of the PS1 as my first real, you're a man now, shape your destiny console, I about shit myself when the game was cinematic. It was mainly a treat that a game entertained you with the same style of cinematography as a big screen movie, or used the same lingo and jargon you heard your friends say on the playground. It wasn't too uncommon for game cutscenes to be mainly at the start of a level or a world, and then at the end, usually to tie up a plot point or give some sort of context. Rarely was a game I played what I call cinematic. I think the first game I ever played that actually could come close to this style of interacting with the story in game was probably Half-Life 2 when I first played it on the orange box on my 360. Something about that game struck me so hard, and it cemented to me how a game can integrate both gameplay and story, and in a way that feels organic, goal-oriented, and engaging. I think I maybe was 13 or 14 when I first played Half-Life 2, and ever since I was always disappointed in games that tried to take their stories seriously or in a way that made the story more important than the actual game sections. I mean, the whole point to me that made Half-Life 2's story so interesting was the fact that the characters felt, well, human. The cast wasn't a bunch of super soldiers who could shrug off wounds. No, Gordon was a dude in a hazmat suit that fried his brain with morphine at every step. Eli was a guy with a troubled and complicated past, having accidentally been part of Earth's downfall. Barney was an average Joe who liked to chill at a bar. Alex is to me and many others the best written and handled female character in a video game, because of her warmth and emotions that carry her throughout the series. She gets hurt, she kicks ass, she gets annoyed at Mossman for her secretive and suspect nature.
Of any research effort going
Enough of your bullshit!
To me as a writer and analyst, I look for stories that really flesh out the fact that characters could be real people. It's why I fucking hate superhero movies and loathe them so much, because yeah, cool, your parents may have been killed and you were an orphan, but Batman is still just some dude who punches people in a gimp outfit. You can't change that. You can't convince me to take something like Sonic seriously when he was born to be an advertisement for Sega products and his fans are middle-aged man-children who jerk it to characters designed for small children. You just can't change that. There's a line where believability is more important to me than something like broad mass appeal. It's why I say something like Skyrim is a fun game, but the story is absolutely summarized as baddragon.com versus shouting LARPer, and I just can't take it seriously when the whole story is so shallow and full of holes. What makes Silent Hill 2's story so interesting is that it isn't even, well, accessible. It's a deep, touchy, and uncomfortable story that not many people have to hopefully ever experience in some areas. I mean, what's easier to recommend to someone? A game about blowing a hole into a spider demon's brain with a laser gun? Or a game about a man shoving his hand into a toilet? Well, I'd be more interested in the toilet thing, that sounds like something right up my alley, but I'm sure that the more lighthearted and fun story is much more appealing. It's especially funny to me as well that in this day and age of supposed awareness and advocacy for mental health and self-discovery, society still sees the mentally ill as ill. There's this uncomfortable and hesitant vibe to want to distance ourselves from those things that make us uneasy or topics that are heavy. It's why I feel it's actually bad to censor words like rape or suicide, because all it shows is a want for the bad stuff to not be real, or code it in something softer. It gives power to the already powerful topics and makes it seem taboo or disgusting that we live in a world where physical and mental atrocities are committed. There's a real sense of progression that's running through current history, don't get me wrong, and just because I'm mentally ill myself, it doesn't mean I want everyone to know the searing agony of an existential collapse. I just wish that people would be more educated into the world of mental health and less disgusted by it, because, you know, the sad reality is, you could be just like me, and all it could take is a car crash, a hostile work experience, or debt to turn your life into a spiraling hellscape of static and uncertainty. Speaking of uncertainty, our game starts off in a very uncertain way. We meet our protagonist, James Sunderland. From outside sources, James was allegedly a store clerk, but like I said, I'm trying to avoid future or external content other than what the game shows us. Besides, it really doesn't matter what his profession, middle name, or favorite cocktail is. James is in a roadside bathroom, contemplating to his reflection about how his deceased wife Mary could possibly be in the town of Silent Hill. He points out a very good reason, dead people don't write letters, but he decides to look for Mary regardless by trying to decipher where the special place was that was mentioned in the letter he received. Without much prodding, James descends down the foggy path that leads to a cemetery right before the main path into Silent Hill, where he startles a young woman who warns him to stay away from the town because something isn't quite right about it. James proceeds to point out that he doesn't really care and he's going to enter anyways. This might be a good time to bring up the voice acting of SH2. Some people claim the voice acting is awkward and stilted and that it could have been better, but, I really think that the awkward and somewhat eerie delivery is actually perfect. I personally have a weird and almost synthetic approach to my speech from years of trauma, isolation, and depression. The closest way I can approximate why I sound the way I do at times is because of a want to sound like I still have normal emotions, and to pick and choose the right thing to say, to convey that I'm not totally empty, and that my brain isn't a mess of about 300 different things at once. It's hard to adequately explain it, but I mean, if you get it, you get it, and that's the only way I can put it. James pushes on into the town where he finds that the streets are actually empty save for a big pile of gore, and a figure in the fog which he decides to follow, which just screams good idea if you ask me. Eventually James stumbles into a construction area where he gets distracted by a radio and introduced to the first monster of the game. Without hesitation, he bashes the thing into the ground, takes the radio, and decides to push on down the streets, which are now populated by more monsters. This is about the time where if I was in this circumstance, I'd go, yeah, this is cool and all, but I think I'll go back to the car, drink a bottle of whiskey, and convince myself this was a fever dream. But no, James keeps going, where he eventually makes his way to the Woodside Apartments. In here, James finds more monsters, a light, and a toy. Jokes aside, James also finds another human being in the apartments, a kid who steps on his hand and gets him into a real huff. Eventually, through some more prodding, James discovers someone else in the apartments too, but we'll talk about him later, don't worry. After a brain-busting puzzle that a millennial or zoomer just couldn't possibly grasp, James pushes deeper into the apartment complex and comes across the figure he saw earlier, violating some of the monsters he ran into so far. If you want my deeper analysis on the monsters, don't worry, I'll go over each one and what they mean, but as a separate video. After unloading enough bullets to make a classic Resident Evil player cry, the figure wanders off, and James reluctantly pushes on. After a few pool parties and juice bars, James comes across another human being in the town. Eddie, who would make a great advocate for the slogan "Crack Kills" if this game came out in the 80s. Eddie doesn't seem to be, doing so hot, so James leaves him to his business, says goodbye, and keeps on trucking on through toilets and trouble until he comes across the woman he met in the cemetery earlier, who now reveals herself to be named Angela. Also, just like the monsters, don't worry, I'll do a deep dive on the main cast as well after this video, so if you feel I'm rushing through this, remember this is just the story segment to give context to my later analysis. With Mr. Cuddy in hand and coin in pocket, James works his way closer and closer to the end of the apartment complex, where he has a wonderful run-in with the figure he's dubbed the Red Pyramid Thing, that fans of the series affectionately call Pyramid Head. The fight is tense on a first run if you don't know what you're doing, but Pyramid Head leaves after a while, and once again, James decides to follow where the creature went. James ends up back onto the cold and foggy streets of Silent Hill, where he runs into the munchkin that stepped on his hand earlier. Despite the whole hand hate, the kid also seems to know who Mary was, which leads James to change his tune from annoyance to curiosity, as so far this is the only person who he's came across that might even have had some sort of information about the whole situation. Regardless of losing the kid, James treks towards Rosewater Park, where he meets another person who looks and sounds almost exactly like his wife, except her name is Maria, her own original character Do Not Steal. At first, James doesn't seem to show a lot of interest in Maria, even with all her gaslight gatekeep girlbossing, and he reluctantly lets her follow him to the next location he thinks his wife might be. A hotel the two stayed at years ago, and supposedly Maria knows the way there. After some mileage, the two stop at a bowling alley where James goes in alone because Maria hates bowling for some reason. I don't know, maybe she's afraid someone will drink her milkshake. Inside the bowling alley, James walks in on Eddie engaging in a little in-out with a pizza, and learns from Eddie that the kid is named Laura. When asked to help, Eddie would rather chow down on that greasy goodness. I mean, I don't blame him, look at that thing. James goes back outside and gets Maria to help him try and track down Laura, where she leads him to a nightclub. Sadly, James can't grind on that pole until his ass hits the floor, but the two catch Laura entering into the next area of the game, Brookhaven Hospital. In the hospital, James shoots skanky cosplayers for a while and eventually comes to a room where Maria needs to lie down, apparently from a hangover because, you know, hangovers just sort of happen. James wanders to the roof of the hospital where Pyramid Head gives him the old 1-2 and into an area that houses a key he needs to progress. Using his mad RuneScape fishing skills, James 99s his way to eventually find Lara. Lara, being the ever so helpful sort, traps James in a room where he faces a foot fetish nightmare come to life, and when the fight is over, James finds himself in what's commonly called the otherworld of Silent Hill. I'll also be covering the town and some backstory later on during the monster section of the video series, so don't worry, I'll give my thoughts on this all later. In this decayed and twisted version of the hospital, James eventually comes across Maria again, who isn't saying grats on James's 99 fishing accomplishment from earlier on. After a hug and some lunch, the couple come across a hallway where Pyramid Head decides to rear his ugly head and impales Maria. James completely breaks down defeated and miserably continues on through the town, this time in a totally dark, more hostile setting, guided only by a mysterious note that eventually leads him into the Silent Hill Historical Society, which loves to show off its clan memorabilia. In this building, James descends into the guts of the town further and further and further until he eventually ends up in the Ring, and then into Toluca Lake Prison, where he runs into the totally stable genius Eddie. In the prison, James comes across the ghost of the Executioner's Chariot from Dark Souls 2 and a scientist from Half-Life, but ultimately finds his way into even more holes that lead further down. But unlike the cool novel, James doesn't find some sploosh, he finds an elevator, which leads him to the subterranean labyrinth of the town. Once in the labyrinth, James discovers that Maria is somehow alive again, but in some sort of prison cell where she drops my favorite line in the entire game.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
She also seems to know more and more about Mary at this point, pointing out a videotape that was left behind in the hotel when James and Mary visited last time. At this point, James agrees to find a way to get to Maria. No, totally, that's all he wants to do, and makes his way through the other half of the labyrinth. At one point in his spelunking, James comes across Angela again, this time with her being confronted by a monster. I have a lot to say on this scene later on, so I'll discuss it in a later video as well. Angela beats on the corpse of the creature and starts to doubt and mistrust James, as opposed to her mainly skeptical and uneasy nature from their earlier encounters. As if this wasn't a blow to James's already virtually non-existent ego, he eventually makes it back to the cell that Maria was in, but rather than being very much alive, she's very much dead. Again. James leaves Maria and hopelessly trudges on, this time into a cemetery, to once again plunge deeper into what looks like a cold and disused freezer. Eddie is down here, but he's worsened, now revealing to James that he, much like Angela, is turned against him, and decides to use Southern justice to solve his problems. After a bit of a firefight, Eddie scampers off into a meat locker and sadistically points out from somewhere in the room how he killed a dog and shot its owner in the knee, showing a much more clear reason as to why he was drawn to hide in Silent Hill from the authorities. Eventually he starts to rip into James, saying how the two are alike and that the town called both of them for whatever reason. But James isn't in the mood for a TED Talk and kills Eddie, ending in a grief-filled moment after the fight. James emerges somewhere near the lake of the town and rows over to the hotel where he and Mary stayed, where he runs into Lara again. After some prodding, she reveals the letter she was using as a way to trap James earlier, and she also mentions how she and Mary were actually friends at the hospital she stayed in, even sharing the same nurse named Rachel, the hidden 17th Colossus. While reading the letter, James questions how old Lara is, noting that the letter mentions her 8th birthday. The answer is a resounding last week, shocking James as he thought Mary died 3 years ago. Before long, Lara runs off again to find a letter she dropped, also from Mary, leaving James to look around for a way to get to the room that he and Mary stayed in. After some fat shaming from an elevator and a trip to the world's coziest bar, James manages to not only find the tape that Maria pointed out that he forgot, but he also clears a path to the room he stayed in. To his surprise, James doesn't find Mary in the room, but puts the tape into an ancient and primordial device known as a VCR. The tape at first reveals some old home video that James took of the trip to Silent Hill years ago, but then shifts into a morbid reality. James suffocated Mary at some point in time during her illness, and the gravity of what James had done shatters him to the point of total numbness. Lara finds him slumped in the chair in front of the TV and tries to snap him to attention. Rather than keep the guilt inside him any longer, James reveals to Lara that he murdered Mary, which sends Lara into a fit of rage, causing her to strike and berate him until she gives up on him and leaves, once again. In this version of the hotel, James can find a tape of one of the conversations he had with Mary's primary care physician, which also reveals that Mary didn't die 3 years ago, and that the 3 years James keeps repeating was rooted from this argument. If we couple this with the fact that Lara mentions her birthday was a week ago, this means Mary has been dead for less than a week at least, and this entire time, James has suppressed the memory of the murder as a form of coping with the trauma. This isn't as far-fetched as you think, as yeah, there's huge gaps in my memory from traumatic events. I can't even remember what being 22 to 24 was like, because most of my life was a mess, and anything from 8 to 13 is just a fuzzy blur of memories that I can occasionally recall bits and pieces of. As James continues on in the warping and ruined hotel, he eventually runs into Angela sadly for the last time. Angela seems totally deluded, and at first confuses James for her mother, which she eventually reels from. She reveals that her mother also pointed out that she deserved the physical and sexual abuse her father inflicted on her, and begins to regress, eventually belittling James and pointing out a very sad reality. He can't help her. After a moment of silence, she even asks James for the knife back, but he refuses, causing her to turn her back to him and ascend up the staircase she's been standing on this whole time. Trying to be the greatest at conversation, James points out that the room is hot, to which Angela says it's always like this for her, and without another word or gesture, she leaves, never to be seen again, leaving James alone and the fire to grow. After a while, James continues through the hotel, eventually leading him to yet another round of emotional bukkake. Maria is trapped by two pyramid heads and impaled, yet again, causing James to at first collapse and admit he needed the two to help punish him and come to grips with what he'd done to his wife. In a final show of defiance against the town and even his own subconscious, James fights back and Pyramid Head commits suicide, to never ever make another appearance in a Silent Hill product again. After this, James walks down a hallway, reliving a memory of Mary berating him for trying to be helpful, giving us an insight of the unintentional emotional trauma that his wife caused him as a result of her own hesitations and fears. This scene always stuck with me the older I got because, well, I've been on both ends of the spectrum. The voice work here is spot on, and that's why I always say a game doesn't need remastering, because the rawness and intensity is just...
James! Wait! Please don't go! Stay with me! Don't leave me alone! I didn't mean what I said! Please, James! Tell me I'll be okay! Tell me I'm not going to die! Help me!
Now this is where things are going to deviate in terms of dialogue based on what actions the player's taken throughout the game, but the scene plays out the same. James comes across Maria or Mary, who transforms into Fleshlips 2.0 and attacks with Mothra beams. It's a very underwhelming fight, but symbolically it's impressive, and I'll talk about it later. After enough lead lollipops, the monster goes down and James ends the nightmare. So, what was it all about? The general consensus is that Silent Hill 2 is about overcoming and accepting guilt. I've seen a few people say it's about mainly just sexual frustration, which is kinda narrow, but I can see where they're coming from. To me, those two above topics are true, but I think to me it's a story about the inevitable loss of a loved one and what that can do to a person's psyche. It's a story about a man who has nothing left to live for after destroying the one thing he did live for. It's a story about the persistence of a soul that's trying to find either purpose or pain. It's a very human story, and to me, when you take out all the complicated symbolism and metaphors, it's something we can all relate to. Even if you don't want to believe me, consider the sad reality of life. It ends. When you're with someone you love day in and day out, watching them fade prematurely and knowing you'll outlive them but you won't forget them, that's real, man. Even if that's not the case, you can apply a friendship in place of an intimate relationship and it's equally as devastating. A family member, a pet, anything. And it's a primal, deep existential dread that we can't even describe in words, but we know the gut-wrenching and mind-spinning pain of. And it'll drive you to your limits. But wait a minute. How does the game end? I've been debating on how to go about this, but I really don't want to spoil the endings. Not because I'm lazy, trust me, because, well, Silent Hill 2 is special to me, and I think the way you end it is unique to how you play the game, which is how it was actually designed. Besides, I also am of the philosophy that you should still actually play the game and experience it for yourself. A Let's Play, this video series, or a wiki, or another less cooler and less sweary video than mine can't really capture the experience of the game. You've also probably noticed by now that I've intentionally summarized the story in a broad way and skipped out on things like puzzles and room designs. It's the same philosophy as the endings to me. You can sit there and absorb all of what I just said and regurgitate it, having learned nothing about the source material in the process, and that's exactly what I don't want you to do. I may sound callous, but yeah, I strongly suggest just playing the game and experiencing the story yourself. I hate when people use things like top 10 videos or random lore videos just to fit in some sort of I know what it is quota, and then those same people spit out stupid statements like, yeah, when the horse dies in Shadow of the Colossus, it was pretty sad. There's no way I can convey certain things from this game to you anyways, like how the dog ending is objectively the best ending, or how I personally feel when I hear Mary's cry for James to stay with her during the hallway memory. Some things are just, they're meant for you to experience, not to be told. It's like how Noah Gervais points out that you can see the Grand Canyon in a million photos, but not really understand the sheer primal instincts that occur when you see it in person. There's just something about the story of Silent Hill 2 that, despite my cynicism, my dark humor, and my repressed nature, it's one of the few things I've ever played that's made me cry because of the emotions it can elicit, the sheer power of the vocal performances, and the genuine realness of the characters and what they've been through. I said in my Let's Play of Silent Hill 2 how the story of the game was done respectfully and maturely, and it came out at the right time from the right people. In this day and age, something like this game's story could happen, yeah. I hate that loaded statement of, it could never be done today, because that's bullshit. Anyone can make anything they want, it's how they make it, and why, that makes something impactful or meaningful. What I meant by the right people at the right time is the fact the game came out in 2001 from Japan and not America. I'm not some sort of weeb, I don't know hardly a damn thing about Japanese culture, except what I've known from weebs. What I do know is American culture and American social politics. In 2023, the time of writing this analysis, America is, well, it's a fucking mess, let's be real here. You have insane right-wing lunatics that scream about shit like climate change being a myth and that God elects the President of the United States. You have insane left-wing lunatics that will gladly tell you you've been living your life wrong the entire time and you should hate yourself for having the audacity of being born white and being straight like it's some sort of genetic curse. The huge problem, and it's gonna sound like such a millennial thing to say, but yeah, it's just old out-of-touch boomers that cling on to power on both sides. The social climate in America as of writing this, yeah, it tends to be in favor of more left-leaning, but that also comes with its own detriments. Things like mental illness in mainstream media and social circles tend to be handled in the worst possible way by the worst possible people to appeal to the worst possible people. I can feel your rage, by the way, going as far as to have already typed up a response that's longer than this entire video series, but hear me out. Trust me, this is something everyone should learn how to do. I can't stand when adults use shit like children's entertainment, the most trite and bottom-of-the-barrel material, to try and generalize complex topics in the most safe and clean way possible. It makes my fucking skin crawl that people get their idea of mental health and how to treat it from shit like workplace seminars that are led by 60-plus-year-old people who only care about making a quota and trying to prove they're hip by saying, just take a day off, dust off the cobwebs, and drop your baggage. I fucking loathe things like the statement, adulting is hard. It pisses me off to no end when someone just says, go get a therapist, it'll solve all the issues. When the modern age's left treats mental illnesses like they're just some sort of quirk that makes you special, especially in regards to neural issues like autism, it just makes the people that legitimately have those issues more alienated and creates more stereotypes that will create more social tensions in the future. By proxy, the people that are on the right will tend to see things like DSBM music as glorifying suicide or that drawing something gory or weird is somehow going to make you a school shooter. There's still this divide of misunderstanding by both sides of what mental health actually is, and well, as someone who suffered from it consciously since the age of 8, it's something that our country currently can't seem to get, and I don't think it will for a long, long time. In my mind, Silent Hill 2's release date is also its biggest blessing. In 2001, mental health was kinda, well, it was backseated socially. I mean, yeah, I can freely say I prefer it that way. I don't know why in this day and age, everyone needs to know someone's political affiliation, sexual orientation, views of pro-life or pro-choice, gun control stance, their opinions on trans and gay individuals, their religious association, or possible mental afflictions, all before they have earned the right to stand near someone at the bus stop. I fully admit to people when I'm socially comfortable to do so, that I have things like OCPD, CPTSD, or MDD, but when it's appropriate. You know, there's a great deal of research you can look into as to why a thing called small talk exists in our social structures, and I wish more people understood that turning deep, complicated fields of study or philosophy into just trends or talking points, it's not only disturbing, it's just disingenuous at best and condescending at worst. Silent Hill 2's story is almost, well, I'd hesitate to say it's neutral in terms of its stance on mental health. On one hand, you have those that say James should be killed for murdering his wife and that he deserves to be punished eternally for his crime. On the other hand, you have people that will say he did the right thing and that his actions are a result of complicated and fragmented emotions and that his reconciliations with his past is more than enough to help him move forward and accept life from that point on. In 2023, there is no way in hell you could say on TV, a film, or a game that a man choking the life from his dying wife was a good thing. Like, seriously, think on that for a minute. This isn't just some sort of loaded question either, this is a fact. If someone said, I have no opinion in this day and age, there would be one side saying the person is obviously a liar, and another side saying the person is guilty by omission. In 2001, you could just say, well fuck man, it's just a video game, why the fuck should it matter? And you know what? I kinda miss that. I miss that time in history when you didn't have to know and absorb every facet of every single thing, and you could be indifferent or flat out uninterested and a mob of people didn't crucify you for saying modern Star Wars is token and hollow. Silent Hill 2 really is a gem, because the game doesn't have a clear defined agenda or motive. It just wants you to think. It wants you to dissect, and it wants you to come to your own conclusions. In this day and age, if something isn't immediately explained to someone, God help them, they might have to engage their critical thinking skills. I mean, fuck, I know, right? Yet socially, I feel that Silent Hill 2 is respectful. It's not overtly offensive, it's not trying to guilt you at every turn, and it's certainly aware that not everyone is going to like it. There's not a whole lot I want to change, really. I don't think that shit like James's day-to-day life is important to the story, and I'm glad it's not a focus. I don't think that we need to have someone go on a long, drawn-out explanation of the town's history the moment James walks into the town. I don't think that we need to know what's under Pyramid Head's helmet because it's not important to the story that's presented. There's a level of maturity to Silent Hill 2's story that I respect, and I wish that more writers, games, and films embraced, and it's summarized very well with a simple statement. Anyone could be like James, like Eddie, or Angela, because we're all human. There isn't a person alive that isn't compelled to do things out of anger, desperation, or what they think is the right thing to do. All of us, including you, have had thoughts like these characters had, and you can't even deny it. It scares the ever-loving hell out of us to think that each person we sit next to in traffic has the ability to just drive into us for no reason, or for a reason, and end our page in the book of life. It is absolutely mortifying to think that the girl that gives you your coffee in the morning might actually be planning to slit her dad's throat because he tells her she's not successful like her sister. There's no way a person can ever tell what someone's been through, or how that person handles their own mental baggage. Hell, for an example, I know that when someone says you should get a therapist, they don't have any ill will, but consider the implications that sentence can be translated to by someone like me. It could mean, you're a mess and I don't trust you. Or it could mean, you depress me, I can't handle or deal with you anymore. I have insurance from my job, yeah, but do you know how long a waiting list for a therapist can be? Do you know that not every therapist is helpful, and that someone as introspective as me finds a great deal of redundancy to repeating my thoughts and emotions to a person? And I'm fully aware that my issues are permanent. All from just one sentence that sounds fairly innocuous? That's all it takes for someone like me. And that's after years of therapy, medication, and healing. So you can imagine what it sounds like to me when someone tries to say, I don't trust Billy Willie because I saw an episode of Criminal Minds that said blurger blur. You think I'm being hypothetical, I bet, when I'm actually being serious. My mom and grandma used to honest-to-God label and diagnose people with disorders simply from watching CSI and Dr. Phil, and I know that there's a group of people just like them that do the exact same thing somewhere else in this world at all times. Media affects public perception whether or not you choose to engage with it. I've literally had someone assume I had autism 6 years ago because they said, and I quote, "Well, you're really smart and you don't lie." Yeah, that was this guy's entire basis of diagnosing me with a neural disorder that was predicated entirely on my intelligence and honesty. Where he got that idea from, I don't even want to know. But do you know how damaging that misconception was? It caused me to nearly quit my old job, and I had a total mental collapse because not only did he think I was autistic, but the entire district, my superiors, and some of the staff on board that day, well, they were all working under the assumption I was autistic. And I didn't know who started this rumor or how long it had been around, but I know one thing for sure, I was fucking livid. It still makes me annoyed, and it's been years since that even happened to me. I even still feel the need to always end that story by saying I'm not autistic, not because I doubt myself, but because the anger from that event and the mental devastation it caused me was so severe that it left me scarred and defensive forever. I am always now incredibly cautious of how I am around new people, and pick and choose my words and mannerisms very carefully to avoid the possibility of someone even trying to hazard that guess again. I'd also like to preface there's nothing wrong with being autistic, but the fact that people thought I was based on someone's perception from some outside influence or the other is why I loathe and despise the power of mainstream media. I mean, stupid people are influenced by stupid things, it's really that plain, unfortunately. Yet to me, Silent Hill 2's story doesn't need to be mainstream to be well understood, in my eyes, because much like the town itself, you actively seek it out, and in filth, it will be found. I mentioned in the last video that what attracts me about a great piece of fiction is the characters and how real and human they can feel. Characters to me signify not just the skill of an actor, but the skills of the creator and how they can make a character feel, well, real and honest. It's why I prefer a cast of nobodies as opposed to a list of big budget actors that everyone knows. You fall into things like typecasting and tropes, like how everyone went up in arms over the new Mario movie in 2023, going off of who's the best fit for what character, even though the actual characters are the most cardboard cutouts of all time and can never truly evolve past the fact they're just marketing items. Big deal, Mario is a piece of toast with no real character, make your peace, you sweaty neckbeards. Insults aside, I think what makes the characters in Silent Hill 2 believable is both their vocal performances and their personalities. Now, I've seen people go on about how the voice acting is bad, and I've mentioned this before, but once again, I feel the way the characters all speak is perfectly fine, and while it's not the greatest, the actors have little touches in their inflections and mannerisms to them that makes them just really sound genuine. You know, it's like in New Vegas when you hear Ten of Spades' stutter because it's implied he has a speech impediment, but it just sounds forced and awkward, like someone who doesn't know how a stutter actually sounds like, or like when someone tries to do a Tourette syndrome impression and all they do is curse.
Ronald McGoddamn-Donald!
There's lots of little things you don't seem to notice until you go looking back for it, but you can hear the voice actors do add a little bit of flavor to each of their lines. It's like, you know, a piece of chewing gum with some ice stuck into it. No, really, try it out later, you'll thank me later. You can tell the performance for James is meant to convey a man who's mentally just sort of checked out. You can hear the slowness to his cadence that implies a lack of self-care, as well as things like how he always sounds uncertain, but in kind of this sheepish and uninterested way.
No, I believe you. It's just, I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going to town either way.
You can hear the nervous highs in Eddie's voice when he starts to get stressed.
I was just joking, James. He was dead when I got here, honest.
You can feel the apprehension in Angela's dialogue when she's speaking to James.
In the cemetery.
I'll be okay by myself. Besides, I'd just slow you down.
And you can almost feel Maria's tongue sliding into your ear, and the tips of her nails almost piercing your skin as she lays her warm and moist... Oh wait, I think I copied something from my super secret adult novels that I write under my pen name. Point is, you can tell the voice actors really did nail their job, especially considering this was 2001. Voice acting for games and stuff really wasn't as serious as it is now, with the market being flooded with rogue and amateur actors. Then again, maybe you can't stand the woman who voices Angela. I don't know, maybe you can't get off without hearing the idea of Sam Jackson as James, like I said earlier.
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
It's all preferential and depends on the person's taste, but as far as I know, the HD version of SH2 that got released in a bundle pack a few years ago, that has both the original and new voice actors as options for the audio. I'd say go with what you prefer, but for the sake of this review and the fact I only own the PC version of SH2, whenever I talk about the delivery or use an example, I'll be drawing from the original voice lines. Oh, and if you are for some reason watching this video first because you're a contrarian and like to push my buttons, I'm also going to analyze the characters under the assumption that you've watched the videos before this one, so don't be shocked when I tell you that Snape kills Dumbledore in the end of the game.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
Avada Kedavra.
I swear, he was like this when I got here.
My name's James. James Sunderland.
Well, if it's really hard to guess at this point, you should know that James is the main character of Silent Hill 2. Our first impression of James based on the camera angle, the music, and the environment is that he's a somber, confused man, and likely not even sure of what he's doing. If we also go off the etymology of his name, Sunderland, we can derive the word sunder, which means fragmented or broken. And land, which I don't play MTG, I play Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're civilized, we use the term field card, okay? James is also derived from Hebrew, which can be interpreted as to replace or supplant. Put that all together and his name could be seen as replaces broken lands. Pretty metal, really. As I said earlier on, James's story before SH2 is kind of ambiguous, but from what we know, he was a store clerk and he visited Silent Hill with his now deceased wife Mary some time ago before she grew ill from a crippling disease. As should be common knowledge at this point, James suffocated Mary sometime into her treatments, possibly after years. From what we can gather from examining the bar in the nightclub, we can also see that James at some point began to turn to alcohol, but it wasn't enough to drown his sorrows. And no, I don't think that James was an alcoholic before he met Mary or after he killed her. I believe it's fairly evident that he simply tried drinking and it only made things worse or nothing seemed to change. James is also not someone prone to violence based on Mary's letter to Lara, and his overall quiet and hesitant demeanor. I believe that James's anger is a byproduct of his pain and not who he is as a person. We can see that in moments of anger and high tension, James doesn't actually dwell or fester on things and simply pushes through them with emotions and slowly reverts back to being submissive and downtrodden.
Or maybe you hated her.
Don't be ridiculous.
So it's okay?
Yeah, fine.
This is common for victims of depression or repeated trauma. I myself can actually vouch for this. Even if I get completely devastated by something or someone, I only process feelings of annoyance for a few moments and then either disintegrate into a crying mess from guilt, or simply revert back to a neutral or low emotional state. It's pretty clear that while James isn't a great person, I mean, yeah, he committed the ultimate sin of humanity, he killed his spouse in an act of uncertain selfishness, yet I don't really think he was a monster before Mary began to grow more and more decrepit. We see and know so little about James prior to the start of the game, but just based on how highly he valued his wife and how he argued with her physician about not doing the best he could, it's likely James had a very solid moral compass.
Mary's going to die? You must be joking. I'm very sorry.
But you're a doctor. It's your job to heal people. How can you just let her die?
In his introductions to Eddie and Angela, we can also see that he's well-spoken, caring, inquisitive, and does seem to show some concern for the other two over the course of his journey into the town. Based on the scenes regarding Angela's want for suicide and Eddie's want for vengeance, James tries to give hope or advice, and even at the lowest points for the side cast, he tries to even tell Eddie he needs help, and refuses to give Angela back the knife from the start of the game. Like, come on man, James is such a bro, I mean look at him. He has persistence, he never gives up, and he really does seem like a kind soul, which makes his act of murder even more shocking and painful. You could argue that James is masking his true intentions or emotions. It's common for people with depression, but I really don't see it. He openly admits to Angela that he believes her about the dangers of Silent Hill, but he just doesn't care. He doesn't hold back on calling Eddie out. He apologizes to Laura for being short and temperamental with her. I don't think James is a liar or untrustworthy based on all the evidence the game shows us. He doesn't have anything to live for in his own mind, so why lie? Why bother manipulating people when the people around him seem to fuck their own lives up further? Why bother harming others when nobody actually harmed him? It's very clear that before Mary's death, James swallowed his emotions and felt that everything was unfair and falling apart. It's likely that work would have been difficult for him, and even Mary points out in the letter that she can see how hard it is for him to even see her in her most vulnerable and broken state. I've seen people try to use the sexualized aspects of Maria and the monsters to give the notion that James was into BDSM, or that he was some sort of big old horn dog, but no, I don't think so. Everything about James was subdued, in vitro, and repressed, to the point where he wasn't feeling anything at all, and yeah, surprise, surprise, I've been there. I've had my libido, my passion for my hobbies, and my own desire to live be destroyed by my own depression. Suppressing urges of any kind, voluntary or not, can create a disconnect from both pleasure and pain and can lead to dissociation, a lack of self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, and self-harm. You hear people who've self-harmed sometimes say, I didn't hurt myself to feel pain, I did it to feel something. And I've been there, and it's sadly one of those things that really only makes sense to those who've legitimately done it. It's like the Korn album's name implies. There's certainly a serenity in suffering that's neither good or bad, and knowing you can feel anything is sometimes what helps you cope and fight. I'm not advocating for self-harm, mind you, it's horrible, and I also scarred my body and mind from it, but I think James was never suicidal or self-harming, but the thoughts kept creeping into his mind at least numerous times. What kept James from ending his life then? Well, Mary. I think it should be pretty obvious that James's driving force is Mary, when she was alive and when she was dead. The couple didn't have children, so when James killed Mary, the world James was a part of no longer had any meaning, which allowed his delusions and distractions to flood his mind. It's clear that James also blocked out even thinking he killed Mary from trauma, and I've said before, it's entirely likely trauma and dissociation can absolutely obliterate and disorient someone's sense of time, place, and perspective. I spent years of convincing myself that a girl that I thought still cared about me didn't abandon me, because she cared about me before, and even though I thought it was a dead relationship, I forced myself to ignore the truth until she eventually said it herself. To say that someone couldn't do what James did, well, you've clearly never been in denial, and I genuinely envy you. If we consider that James isn't also some sort of heroic or interesting person, it makes him more tragic and realistic. Like I said, I can't get invested in characters that are overly competent or overly capable. I mean shit, consider your spouse is suddenly terminally ill and there's no sign of improvement. Consider what that would do to you. It would be torture, and no amount of preparation can make that an easy pill to swallow. I mean, I'm not a traditionalist, I mean fucking look at me, but I also view marriage as a special and sacred ceremony, unlike contrarian millennials and zoomers that want to say marriage is a joke and something that you put down on your tax filings. Fuck the religious fluff that got thrown into wedding ceremonies, and fuck the whole marriage is what makes you property adage that came from abusive monarchies. Marriage is a ceremony of humanity that's been passed on for thousands of years. To lose a spouse, figuratively and literally, is losing your other half of what makes you... you. Whether James lost Mary to sickness or by his own hand, it's completely irrelevant. The pain is soul-shattering, and the build-up to it was likely equally as devastating. Consider that your spouse is lying there, dying in pain and lashing out. You know that their survival is slim to none. Seeing other people will inevitably cross your mind. We're a social species, as cliche as that sounds to say, but how can you just forget and move on when a person you've committed your entire life to is just dying? Can you even accept that fact? I'd also like to add humans are hardwired for physical intimacy. You can cross your arms and scoff thinking you're above the world for abstaining from sex like some sort of ultra neo-Puritan. That's cool. I did that for almost a decade, and all it did was decimate my mind to deny a basic human instinct. Sex isn't just some sort of animal need, it's a huge display of trust, emotion, and passion for humans, and we are one of the few species of animals on our planet that we know of that can actually take pleasure in the act of intercourse, rather than use it as some sort of strictly reproductive tool. Just the act of being close to someone we're intimate with releases chemical responses in our bodies that can lower blood pressure, help ease the mind, and cultivate a sense of trust and safety. It's not just that James wasn't putting his penis into Mary that caused him pain, no. It's that James was likely alone, physically and mentally, for the duration of Mary's final moments on Earth. Consider that Mary points out in her letter to James that the doctor says she might be able to go home for just a while. Like, really put that into perspective. Imagine waking up alone and meandering your way to work. Imagine having to stand at a register day in, day out, forcing a smile and some small talk to not only clientele, but also your coworkers. Now imagine coming home to no kids. No smile. Nothing. Your checks are also likely being spent on outrageous and ever-growing medical bills that your measly insurance can barely cover. You're only able to see someone you love a few times in the month, and when you do, you're not truly alone with them. They're sick, in pain, and their mind is a whirlwind of fear and terror that you can't fix. You make dinner for yourself, alone. You crawl into bed, alone. In a house that now feels like a prison. And you know you're eventually going to be truly alone from the other person's death. You can't even put your hand on them to comfort them, or hear their heartbeat from their chest, or feel the warmth from the cold at night. Is that fantastical? Is that something that only a handful of people have ever experienced? Is that something a little too real? Did anything I say in the last few paragraphs elicit a knee-jerk reaction of discomfort? If you couldn't tell, this is why I say there's a level of maturity involved with characters like James that you don't get with modern writing and storytelling. It's either all the way or just surface level. With James, anyone can take a look at any frame from the cutscenes of SH2 and be able to piece together his background and also able to relate in some way, or at least come close to understanding what it's like to be him. James really is a broken man in every sense of the expression. His life is essentially meaningless. If he goes back to life, he's either a felon, financially broken, or mentally broken from the inevitable acceptance of having committed a murder. If he chooses to die, he's at least with his wife and his pain will be over, but his life will have been cut short, just like Mary's, and likely affect his remaining family and friends on top of Mary's remaining family and acquaintances. There's no easy solution, and Silent Hill as an entity in the story knows this, and creates an out for James when he arrives.
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
It's safe to say the most important side character that James comes across in the story of SH2 is Maria. Not only is Maria important in understanding how James works as a character, but she's important to show just how dangerous and magical the town of Silent Hill is. And that's magic with a K, mind you, since you know it's serious shit. Maria does have a side campaign that was released later on titled Born from a Wish, but I'll be looking at that some other day, and I think it deserves its own video in the future. Regardless of Born from a Wish, Maria came into existence when James was drawn to Silent Hill. It's clear that the town tailored her to be an ideal version of what Mary was, based on James's subconscious and suppressed urges. She wears somewhat revealing clothing, talks with an air of sensuality, and also has a fairly carefree attitude and demeanor. She also has a tattoo of a butterfly on her midriff, which can be interpreted as a symbol of rebirth as well. The name Maria can be stemmed from Latin to mean of the sea or rebellious, and is also another name that's similar to Mary, like Miriam or Mariah. If we go from the of the sea meaning, the sea has historically been considered a dangerous and chaotic place, and this could also tie in the fact that she's born from James's chaotic and fragmented mind. The rebellious interpretation could also relate to her provocative outfit and mannerisms as well. Likely, my mind leans on her name being an alternative name similar to Mary to lure James's psyche to find her more appealing. We first see Maria in Rosewater Park, and I find it curious and unsettling how there are no other enemies in the park. It's just her. At first glance, James confuses Maria as Mary, even going as far as to smile with some excitement at the prospect of seeing her again, After a bit of playful banter, she eventually does switch to some seriousness as James actually considers going on through the town without her, prompting her to panic.
You're coming with me?
You were gonna just leave me?
No, but...
With all these monsters around?
No, I just...
I'm all alone here. Everyone else is gone.
This is likely to get James to feel sympathy for her, as remember, Maria is a construct of the town's energy, and is still a monster at heart, designed to get under his skin. She's the vor monster of the game that you just don't know about. Now, in regards as to why she won't go into the bowling alley, I think it's because she's a monster and nobody else could see her but James, so she more than likely didn't want to make James question her existence or not. Or she just plain sucks shit at bowling, but I think it's the former. We can also see that as James follows her, she guides him over to the nightclub she works at, which I've always seen as a not so subtle way of her trying to seduce James somehow. I mean, he sure as hell isn't trying very hard. You can also see that the neon sign in the bar is likely a pregnancy metaphor. I've always thought of this as showing that Maria can bear the children that Mary couldn't give James. Whether or not that's actually possible, I mean, human to monster bits could be... interesting? I still feel that's the intended purpose of the sign, though. While Maria is in the hospital with James, she also appears to start growing ill, which she just regards as a hangover, likely to make James feel worry as she pops a pill and lays down, yet again attempting to lull James into a vulnerable state. Somehow she also ends up in the other world, and when she reunites with James, she begins to emasculate him, likely mirroring Mary's volatile mental state to try and garner more sympathy.
You couldn't care less about me, could you?
No, I just...
Then stay with me. Don't ever leave me alone. You're supposed to take care of me.
We can also see as the audience this doesn't entirely work when she hugs James, because he just sort of stands there trying to hide his stiffy. We also get a small glimpse into the fact that Maria not only has her own personal identity, but she shares some of Mary's memories and traits as well, and she also feels empathetic towards Lara. This concept is further expanded on in Born from a Wish, but like I said, some other time. Regardless, Maria gets killed by a Pyramid Head, and I've always viewed this as the town forcing James to feel like he can't keep Maria safe, just like how he couldn't cure or console Mary when she was ill. It's also something you might not notice on your first time through the game, but if you're playing on hard mode, you understand way too well. Pyramid Head is always going to beeline straight towards Maria and not James. There's some obvious programming stuff to this, but I feel like if Maria wasn't with James in this instance, Pyramid Head wouldn't have even cared, and he likely would have killed her at some other junction. Since the two are both theoretically allied to the town, I feel like Pyramid Head killing Maria is a totally planned act to torment and bring James further down, but we'll talk about Mathman later. As far as Maria having an idea that she was going to die, I think personally, yeah, she knew she was going to get killed here in some form or another, because even though she clearly has some form of actual self-consciousness or personality, she's still a puppet of the town designed to torment and trap James. Shockingly, the next time we see Maria, it's all the way into the labyrinth near the end of the game. I've always viewed her appearance here as being made possible by the lower depths of the town having some sort of stronger energy as opposed to the upper section. This is still my favorite moment in the game because of Maria fully embracing the fact she's able to be molded to whatever James wants, and she actually succeeds in getting him to at least make some sort of effort to get to her, regardless if he was sexually into her or not. I feel he's more motivated to try and save her, rather than do the dirty, because Maria is appealing to his sense of wanting to save and protect Mary when she was ill, and that's why she dies on his return. I've always interpreted this as the town itself killing her to further punish James and remind him of murdering Mary, as well as enforce a sense of defeat, just like with the elevator scene. I'll talk more about this later, but for now, I think the entire point of Maria's deaths are to intentionally make James repeat an endless cycle of guilt and shame, as no matter how hard he tries, he will never fully save or be with Maria. And I feel this is enforced in the Maria ending, when she starts to sound ill and essentially repeats the process of what happened to Mary, but possibly for all eternity, as punishment for James not having learned anything. Yet again, Maria takes a backseat for a long time, and her last standard appearance is at the intro of the Pyramid Head boss fight. We can see she's tied to a bed frame and stabbed, sending James to his knees, where he fully admits that Pyramid Head and Maria were both designed to punish him, but he's learned the truth and wants to fight back. Regardless of the ending the player is going to receive, I feel that this moment was designed to snap James back into a panicked and broken state, as he was actually breaking the town and going against it, and this was its last-ditch effort to try and bring him back to a state where he was earlier by any means necessary. After the fight, it's entirely dependent on which ending the player has chosen if the final boss is Maria or Mary, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll just make the assumption that we're looking at this from the Leave ending, where the manifestation is Maria but dressed as Mary. This cutscene always stuck with me because it goes further into the idea that Maria is so well constructed by the town that she actually shows some genuine want for James to be with her.
But I can be yours. I'll be here for you forever. And I'll never yell at you or make you feel bad. That's what you wanted. I'm different than Mary. How can you throw me away?
I think it's the voice work here that emphasizes the desperation that Maria knows she will cease to exist now that James admits he doesn't need her and has forgiven himself. I also view the monster design here as alluding to not only the Flesh Lips fight from earlier, but also as a sort of metaphor for both the crucifixion of Christ and the Virgin Mary from Christian mythology. We can see what looks like thorny spikes on the end of the bed frame, similar to the crown of thorns worn by Christ during his crucifixion, as well as the fact Maria's arms form a dominating T-pose. This also may be a reference to the Cross of St. Peter, or as a bastardization of occult imagery, like with how the incubus looks similar to Baphomet, or how the Order's symbol is a hodgepodge of various alchemical and occult symbols. For some Satanist and occultist practitioners, the upside down cross usually interprets as a disrespect towards Christianity or organized faith as a whole, but this depends on who you ask, and as an ex-occultist myself, I don't view it as anything more than edgy imagery, meant to instill fear of the unnatural, and I think that's likely what they were going for here in the game. We can see that Maria can't move her head fully due to some metal device, and I'm sure this may be a stretch, but this could likely also be a subtle similarity to Pyramid Head's helmet design that reinforces the idea of sharp, uncomfortable angles. But I also think that this design is slightly intentionally reminiscent of religious and occult imagery. Most all holy figures in Christian mythology can be seen with a halo behind their head to symbolize the person's importance to God. If we look at the shape of the thing around Maria's head, it's an inverted triangle, which, yeah, to a normal person will just say, well shit Seth, that's a fucking triangle, how deep can you really make that? An inverted triangle has also been associated as a symbol of femininity, likely because of how women's bodies tend to curve and the design of the uterus. Also, ancient alchemical symbols represent water as an inverted triangle. Bet you didn't expect symbolic history with Seth today, but here we are. Also note that Maria's wearing a wimple, not a habit, but the design is meant to evoke imagery synonymous with the Mother Mary, which is also a play on the whole Maria Mary naming scheme. So yeah, Maria's life has ended as quickly as it was born into existence, and I still think she's one of the most interesting characters in a game, because while she's still a manifestation of James's mind and the town's magic, she's clearly got some agency, and when you put that into perspective, it's almost tragic. She existed out of punishment and lust, but she still has a mind, memories, instincts, fear. It's really something understated, but when you think about it, it gets darker and darker and makes Maria even more memorable and one of my favorite characters in fiction. There's probably someone that's salty, but I really want to make a separate video for the sidecasted characters because, well, I really don't want to make one massive video with a million small edits, so please understand, it's not just for me, but for the sake of Sony Vegas. I mean, Jesus, you don't even know until you've done it, man. So join me next time for the supporting cast of the story where we get to talk about everyone's favorite character, the pizza. So Silent Hill 2 has a pretty small cast of side characters outside of James and Maria. Anyone who's worked with any video editing software can tell you that trying to edit a long-form project is like performing surgery with a blindfold and hoping you're not going to sever something useful. Yet, I also think that the side cast of SH2 is equally as important as the big two. I'd also like to start by saying we also only know as much about the side cast as they choose to tell James, and so, yeah, the information I give could be muddled or incorrect, it's entirely possible. Let's start off with the easiest to understand character on paper, but one that's fairly ambiguous, Lara.
What's a little girl like you doing here anyway?
Huh? Are you blind or something?
Lara's name really does seem to be a random pick, as her name stems from Bay Laurel, or in the words of the greatest Gopnik of all time, the Bay Leaf. I couldn't find too much symbolism or interpretation on Laurel's in relation to the character, so as far as I can honestly tell you, I think it's just a name. Lara first shows up by stepping on James's chunky man hand in the apartment building and kicking a key he's trying to grab. Right off the bat, we're shown that she's alone and doesn't seem to want to talk or explain anything to James, simply choosing to ignore him and continue about the apartment complex. Our next encounter with Lara is after the first Pyramid Head fight, where she can be seen sitting on top of a bit of wall that's decorated in childish graffiti. It's hard to tell, but you can see that she's also holding a letter in her hands, which comes up later on in her story. James remarks about her being the dreaded hand stamper of Silent Hill, also showing us that Lara is a bit of a sarcastic kid. I've always interpreted her questioning James if he's blind as a subtle nod to the fact that Lara doesn't seem to see the town as hostile or different, rather than just, vicious, horrible kid speak. We can also see that Lara at least knows who Mary was, and to me at least who James is. This may explain why she stepped on his hand earlier out of some petty dislike towards him from earlier in her time at the hospital with Mary, or kids being soulless monsters. Our next glimpse of Lara is at the bowling alley, with Eddie and that beautiful pizza, where she questions Eddie about why the cops are after him, to which she lays down some M-rated language, and then runs off outside towards Brookhaven Hospital. It's not until much later that we see Lara again, near the first Otherworld transition, in a room with a few plush toys, probably reenacting a scene from Full Metal Jacket.
You had best unfuck yourself, or I will unscrew your head and check down your neck!
Lara?
Huh?
Here we can see that she's skeptical of James still, and also has a different timeline of events as she says she met Mary at the hospital the year prior, which sends James into Anakin Skywalker mode, which gets him locked into a room and beaten with a foot fetish monster. It's important to note James points out to Lara that he's shocked she isn't injured despite how dangerous the town is to him, which also leads into a common question: what does Lara see in the town? While we're never given a full example of what Lara sees, I think it's safe to assume to her, Silent Hill is just an empty town. I don't believe she sees any monsters or has any ill experiences, because she actually hasn't committed any crime or evil. This can also lead to another question that I'm sure you could also wonder: is Lara real if Maria is a construct of James's psyche? I don't think that Lara is fake, because as I said in the Maria section of the last video, one reason I don't think Maria can enter the bowling alley is because she's strictly a monster of James's mind and can't manifest to the other human characters for fear of confusing and disorienting James's sense of reality. Lara seems to be real because her stories and accounts are accurate and she interacts with Eddie and James at the same time in the bowling alley. Anyways, the next experience with Lara is actually fairly late into the game, where she scares James at the piano in the hotel and finally gives him a letter from Mary that reveals Lara is likely an orphan and that she and Mary were close during their time in the hospital, even having the same nursing staff. I always feel like this scene is so well done, by the way, with the music, the fact the player gets to read the letter at their own pace, and that this is the start of James's realization that his timeline of events doesn't match up to reality. Lara's last canonical appearance is in the room 312, when James tells her the truth that he murdered Mary. I like the delayed reaction that Lara gives here, as if you tried to say something like this to an 8-year-old, they'd probably also be unable to cope or process what you just said, and they'd also likely react in the same awkward and violent way. There's something about the tired and exhausted why she gives James that really sells how heartbroken and devastated this news is to her, because it's easy to see that Lara really did like Mary, and was most likely looking forward to being adopted by her in the future. It's also likely that Lara felt annoyed with herself for even considering that James was a good person, and felt betrayed for giving him another chance for redemption. In the Leave ending, we can see that James and Lara both exit the graveyard, but like I said in the story section of the series, how you end the game is up to you and how you played. If we're going from this ending, it's easy to assume that the two exit the town and go back to living life as normal as they possibly can. I feel Laura is very difficult to pinpoint in the story, and I find her the most challenging character to analyze because we know so little about her. There's never a clear reason as to why she's in Silent Hill, but I think I know why, and it's that the letters she received from Mary are the town's way of moving James from one area to the next through someone closely involved with Mary before her death. She could legitimately be dropping the letters and misplacing them. I mean, hell, kids are kids. I lost so many fucking things it's ridiculous. But I think the town itself misplaces the letters to help shepherd James along. We can see that after the revelation that James killed Mary, the letters James had with him the whole time suddenly become blank now that he's accepted responsibility for her murder, so it's likely that the letters Laura finds are real, but ghosts in and out of reality. Notice how we also don't see Laura at any point in the other world or lower depths of the town either, hence why she's not able to see or interact with the evil energy that lurks around. Her reason for even going into Silent Hill is just to find Mary based on the stories and pictures Mary would share with her from that place. She's not there as a punishment like James or the others, and that's also why the town has such a minimal influence, or if any, I feel. If I try to swing the narrative over to the fact that all the characters James interacts with and sees are aspects of his own psyche reflected, we could also see that Laura represents his past joy and innocence in life through her younger nature. We could also say that Laura is a reminder of James of his inability to have a child with the woman he loved as well, and I sort of feel like both of these options are entirely on the table. Like I said, there's so little about Laura as far as her background, and I also don't care if Ito said that she was a monster from the depths of Eddie's ass crack next week in a Twitter post. I think she's just a kid. There's not much more to her in my mind other than what we see of her, and I kind of enjoy the lack of information better because Laura is a good example of what happens when a normal person enters the town of Silent Hill. It's just another place. I mean, as far as we know, the whole game could take place in less than a time span of 3 hours, and afterwards Laura just goes into life again, having just vague memories of the events as she ages. I can barely remember being 6, so if my dad told me that I got lost in a town for a few hours, I'd probably just go, okay, sure. I mean, my dad lost me in a hardware store once, but that's an entirely different story, and that was awful.
Killing a person ain't no big deal. Just put the gun to their head, pow.
Up next, we have the pizza demon himself, Eddie Dombrowski. Eddie is a younger, obese man introduced to James in the apartment section of the game, first heard rather than seen, throwing up, which leads to a wonderful shot of Eddie's Grand Canyon in all of its glory. Jokes aside, Eddie's first name's roots likely stem from the name of Edward, which translates as wealthy guardian in Old English. Dombrowski is simply a Polish surname meaning oak-wood or copse. If I had to guess anything from the etymology of Eddie's entire name, it's likely that his last name was just a stand-in, but his first name containing the word wealthy could relate to the old concept that obesity and pallor signified the ability to indulge in the excess. Now, if you're pale and fat, you're just a Redditor. If there is any meaning of Dombrowski as a name, oak trees are generally regarded as very sturdy and useful, both in the lumber industry and in nature. Well, mind you, this is also coming from an Oregonian where lumber is historically the backbone of the old Pacific Northwest. Now it's just pot and lunatics. But Eddie is very clearly anything but sturdy, strong, or smelling good, so maybe his name is a jab at his overall emasculated and flabby form. As mentioned before, James first sees Eddie throwing up in an apartment's bathroom. The room before the cutscene introducing Eddie also has a corpse lying in the fridge that James can examine, and this leads to a good question of whether or not Eddie actually killed whoever the corpse belongs to. To me, I think Eddie killed whoever it was, and the other reason is that the corpse is suspiciously shoved into a fridge, a location where food is stored, and the blood splatter on the fridge indicates the blood landed on the fridge and can also be seen pooling near where I'm guessing the hips are on the corpse. That's right, I played Condemned 1 and 2, I'm a good boy. We can also see that Eddie is extremely paranoid and hesitant, as the very first thing he says to James before he even says his own name is that he's innocent and he didn't kill the thing outside. Paranoia is a common trait among mentally ill individuals and can generally be a result of guilt and trauma. But in Eddie's case, it's very likely it's from guilt, as we'll also see this later on in his story. Something to note as well is that Eddie isn't from Silent Hill, the town, and that he was drawn there from his guilt and ill intentions. He used the town to hide from the police according to his conversation with Laura in the bowling alley scene, and you could argue that Eddie might be lying to Laura, but I think he did hide from the police based on the fact he didn't kill the man he shot, and it's likely that the victim just called the police in response to his assault and murder of his dog. I've also always interpreted this intro scene of Eddie throwing up as an early sign of him not wanting to accept responsibility after he kills the monster in the previous room, which causes him to grow anxious and vomit. To me, the monster or thing likely represented the bully he shot in the knee, and the fact he killed the monster put him into shock because remember, he never actually committed a murder in the first place, only on the bully's dog. Eddie later shows some sadistic glee in how the animal died, but I think in this scene right here he may still be a redeemable person and may actually still feel some sliver of remorse for his actions. Regardless, James can also walk into the room near Eddie and notice some football paraphernalia, further cementing to me that the monster was the bully he shot. It's likely Eddie sought safety in this apartment after being scared by the monsters outside, walked into this room, and noticed the bully in the chair. Notice how the chair is positioned in a way that it would be the first thing someone would see in the doorframe. Eddie panicked and backtracked into the kitchen area, shot the monster, tried to hide it, and threw up before James walked in. After a while, we see Eddie again in the bowling alley talking to Laura, where she tries to ask him about his crime, but he just ignores her and complains that nobody can forgive him. Jokes aside about the luscious pizza, I think the pizza is a pretty easy metaphor about Eddie's gluttony and laziness. I didn't even notice it until writing this analysis, but you can see that it's also not just one pizza, but two, and the name of the brand is All Stars Pizza, likely referencing the bully he shot being a football player, as All Star is generally a term associated with elite sports players and, you know. All Star Pizza in Oregon, go now, beat the rush. We also see that Eddie lacks quite a bit of self-esteem, and I mean that because, think about it, he just got burned by an 8-year-old and he's likely in his 20s. For God's sake, she's actually just a damn kid. You can wave your car keys in front of her face and go, guess who could actually reach the pedals, and make fun of her for being adopted or something. Shit, dude, no grown-ass man lets a random kid put them down. Eddie also ignores James's hostility here too, displaying he doesn't really care about everyone around him at this point. Remember, in the first cutscene with Eddie, he actually tells James to take care, and in this one, we can see he barely even remembers James's name, when it's likely only been a matter of minutes since their last encounter. Our next experience with Eddie is in the start of the prison section where he's sitting in a mess hall near a corpse, but this time he's holding a revolver and he's clearly starting to lose the plot. According to Eddie, he shot the dude next to him for making fun of me with his eyes, which, that's a thing. Eddie also starts to show some more violent tendencies at this point too, showing a disregard for basic morals, explaining how earlier he let everyone walk on him and even drops a hint about the dog he shot. When James tries to talk some sense into his skull, Eddie simply changes the story about the dead guy near him, pretends what he said was a joke, and casually decides to go on alone. In my mind at this point, Eddie has basically failed to learn why he was in Silent Hill and was embracing his violent side as opposed to James, who was actively trying to understand what the town was showing him. In Eddie's mind, he thinks that he should just embrace violence and fear tactics rather than actually improving himself, and it's likely that whatever monsters or entities that Eddie is encountering in the town are likely just being gunned down rather than listened to or bargained with. Eddie's comment about being looked at weird, even though I made fun of how stupid it sounds earlier, is common amongst people suffering from paranoia or guilt, and that strangers or those around you are conspiring against you based on their body language, even if it's true or not. I'm not sure I'd classify Eddie as a sociopath, but I would certainly call him a psychopath, as he does check quite a few of the traits needed for someone to be one. Frequent lying, lack of remorse, lack of regard for safety, and warped perception of right and wrong. I don't think that Eddie has the charm, cunning, or planning skills of a sociopath because he's shown to have more cowardice and laziness, whereas a sociopath will tend to be more goal-oriented and driven, but hell, I'm not a doctor, just severely mentally ill. I think Eddie still has some respect for James at this point because in his mind, James hasn't done anything to upset him just yet, and he clearly instills a sense of fear in him with his unhinged rant about shooting someone. He likely views James as submissive and someone he can use or order around, but he hasn't fully tested his limits on him just yet, as he will do later on. Hence why he drops the edgelord act when James tries to talk some sense into him. Eddie is also in a cafeteria in this scene, and the tablet of the gluttonous pig can be found a few feet away from where he's at, and I mean, if you can't put two and two together, I'll do it for you.
It tastes like a
Pizza.
Perhaps just one more?
Sue me.
Our final encounter with Eddie is in the labyrinth section of the town. We actually get to see a glimpse of how Eddie likely sees the town, as this manifestation is of a meat locker or some sort of freezer, which to me has always been sort of symbolic of Eddie's weight and his personality going into a colder and more twisted direction. In the first room of this freezer, we can also see a bunch of corpses strewn about, which Eddie can be seen laughing at and admiring before James walks in and snaps him to attention. Eddie also goes into a rant about how people used to treat him, bringing up his weight and appearance as a reason to justify gunning down just about anyone who even dares question him, and just as he's about to walk away, James decides that now is the time to ask the man with a loaded firearm and a bad attitude,
Eddie, have you gone nuts?
Yeah, real big brain idea right there. Obviously this shatters Eddie and causes him to snap on James, causing the most awkward boss fight in the history of the world to happen, which causes him to run away after he gets shot a few times because, you know, a bullet to the body isn't lethal or anything. James pursues Revolver Not So Hot further into the meat locker, and we also get a somewhat tragic and sad moment from Eddie, where he questions James if he's ever been ridiculed or picked on for how he looks. However, any sympathy for him generally goes out the window the moment Eddie tells him how he killed the bully's dog, relishing in the gory glory of its suffering, and eventually shooting the owner in the knee to cripple him. I personally think that Eddie was too much of a coward to actually murder the bully because even though he could kill a dog, he probably couldn't bring himself to execute his victim, as at this point in his mind, he probably still has a shred of decency left in him preventing the murder. But, once he entered Silent Hill out of fear, it's likely that he became morally bankrupt, like the remake of Silent Hill 2 coming out. James at least has a good scene here where he calls Eddie out, saying how he needs help, but the response he gets back has always stuck with me.
You think it's okay to kill people? You need help, Eddie.
Don't get all holy on me, James! This town called you too! You and me are the same! We're not like other people! Don't you know that?
I love that Eddie says the town called James as well and that they're the same kind of person, and he likely doesn't respond due to the fact that there's actually a sliver of truth in his point. Regardless, James guns down Eddie, and that's the unfortunate end for Solidus Chris's saga in Silent Hill 2.
Okay, yeah, you listen to that and you take in the words from that.
Now, I've always liked Eddie as a villain, and no, it's not for just his pizza cunnilingus skills. No, I think Eddie reflects an aspect of James back to him, especially in the final scene in the freezer, where he says they're alike. Both of them have committed crimes, yes, but their violence was committed as a response to stress and environmental pressure. While James didn't put a 45 to Mary's head and pull the trigger, the point is, he, just like Eddie, was acting on impulse and recklessness. Eddie also strikes me because, yeah, this luscious goth you see today wasn't the splitting image of Peter Steele and Brian Warner. No, I used to be overweight. And then I was obese. Then I was morbidly obese. When I was 15, I weighed roughly 265 or so pounds and was barely 5'9". I luckily was able to change my life around, but it wasn't easy, and it was also equally as challenging to admit it was mainly from my own fault. I may have had asthma my whole life, but growing up, I used to use that as an excuse to justify not exercising, and I ate constantly because of stress and depression, because I was developing obsessive-compulsive traits at a young age. I got bullied my entire life, all the way until I was in high school, going as far back as grade school. I was called names, rejected by girls I liked, and mocked for being a greasy, fat teenager. It got to me so often that I didn't even want to talk to people after a while, and became a genuine introvert until I was a junior in high school and had started to take care of myself more, because I nearly died from H1N1 at 15. To this day, I may be thin and lanky, but I have the stretch marks, the self-harm marks, and damaged body to prove my journey. It sounds like it's a good thing, you know, beating obesity, but it wasn't without a cost. I damaged so much of my body by not taking care of myself for so long, and my first approach was anorexia, which, yeah, going from extremely overweight to intentionally underweight after being deathly ill? Yeah, it was a recipe for disaster. My stomach was obliterated, and I developed a severe form of acid reflux known as GERD. Because I was still a teenager and developing, my bone structure and how my skin stretched so often caused me to have a lisp on top of my already stress-induced stutter. My god-awful posture and habits at such a young age caused my overall balance as an adult to be off, as my full height is actually 6'4", but my shoulders and spinal alignment are so awkward that I actually struggle to straighten my posture out. The mental side is also just as bad, as yes, I'm extremely subconscious of not just my physical appearance, but my vocal performance as well. To this day, I'm constantly worried I have what I can only describe as fat voice, or that my skin on my neck will contort to make it look like I have a double chin, despite the fact that my jawline could cut steel and my voice is as soothing as a warm bath or shower. I won't judge if you like showers over a bath. Regardless, yeah, I was Eddie at one point in time. I felt hatred towards not only myself, but those around me. I would never cause harm because I could never bear the guilt, but I certainly tried to retaliate against people for calling me out, claiming things like, they just don't understand, or they just don't have the same life I have, as if that actually meant anything. I even almost sent my dad to the hospital when I was 14 because he called me fat and I threw a tennis ball into his junk. Eddie to me has always represented the idea that a person can be in denial and be selfish in a way that implies they choose to become colder rather than embrace responsibility and improve their life. It's so damn easy to just sit there and make excuses for why you don't want to fix your problems. And I don't mean that with just your body weight, but your overall life. It's one thing to have circumstances stacked against you, that's fair. I'll admit you could be like Danny DeVito and look like something out of a fucking fever dream, or you could look like something like Peter Steele and have a body and voice carved out of the marble gates of heaven itself. Have I mentioned Peter Steele enough yet? Yet your outer appearance is barely a half of your whole existence, and it changes constantly throughout your life, and a lot of it you can control. And you only have yourself to blame if you fill your body with garbage and not decide to take actions. Like Steven Seagal. Bullying is also an unfortunate part of life, and it's also how you react to it that makes you a stronger person. Violence doesn't solve anything, and even if you get pushed to the point of wanting to harm someone, honestly, think about it, man. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth destroying your life and mind to sink to the same level of a bully? Some instances, I get it. We all have limits, and you can only take so much. But if you constantly dwell on revenge and harming someone, you do need help, honestly, and it's something that I feel should be taught in public education, not just with some 5-minute interruption to a class about how bullying is bad. It should go without saying, in this day and age, I dread even going to get a loaf of bread because I have a genuine phobia of being gunned down by some lunatic incel, but you know, as a culture and as a species, we need to find better ways of dealing with red flag behaviors, especially when it comes to both victims and instigators of bullying. Many issues start in adolescence and manifest into genuine problems in adulthood, and someday I pray we as a society can find a way to weed out these potential threats that's both humane and constructive. There isn't an easy answer like get rid of all weapons and firearms or censor and remove bad words or remove social media. No, the issues are in neurochemistry, poor life choices, and shitty people doing shitty things. All of which can be avoided and detected, and it's worse to do nothing because it's not your problem or you don't want to get involved. Someone like Eddie isn't fake or impossible, and that's what's sad. I've met too many people that are like Eddie, and it makes me uncomfortable to even type this all out because I can give at least half a dozen examples of people I've known just from my teenage years that embody the exact mentality that he portrays in this game. It's not my fault, nobody cares, and everyone else is a piece of shit. And most of those people I knew are in jail or prison, reforming their lives after committing crimes, or have become so far gone from mental delusions, they're no longer the same person I knew years ago. And it's sad. It really is. I mean, I'm not innocent in this either. I was a monster as a teenager. I still act impulsively and irrationally, from long-lasting mental scars carved into my mind by thinking the whole world was against me and that I had to survive rather than live. But I admit it. I knew I needed help. I knew that I had to change my life, and I'm glad I did. I know for a fact I could never enact violence on others, but I certainly know I didn't care what I did to myself. And that's not any different at the end of the day, because I know I strained those around me by pushing away and blaming myself. And there's nothing wrong with admitting you need to change, because everyone around you can suggest it to you subtly or not, but you ultimately have to put both feet forward and not just leave one foot behind in the doorframe to the room you locked yourself into.
Angela.
Angela, okay. I don't know what you're planning, but there's always another way.
So, Angela is obviously a character I have a lot to say about. If you see my LP of SH2, you should know that I actually probably spent the most time talking about her, especially at the end. In fact, yeah, this section you're hearing took a few weeks to write and formulate simply because, well, yeah, man, this is a character that I sadly relate to a lot, and finding the right way to go about it in a video essay is actually a lot harder than I thought, as opposed to the sporadic and non-scripted way of an LP. Starting from the name, Angela's etymology stems from the word messenger in Latin, or messenger of God if you want to get ultra cool. Her last name, Orozco, is of Spanish origin and translates as the son of bringer of wisdom. If we try to find any form or meaning in these two names, it could translate into English as maybe messenger of wisdom or bringer of messages. I lean more on the idea that her name is mainly there to sound like Angel, which makes her a more tragic character, but that's just how I look at it. Surprisingly, Angela is the first person that James actually sees in Silent Hill's graveyard, and I feel this moment is quite memorable, maybe due to the awkward dialogue, the music, and the overall vibe of the scene. We see a lot of subtle things about Angela straight away in these opening shots. Number 1, from the moment she's on screen, she's nervously clutching her arm. Number 2, she's easily startled. Number 3, she's extremely apologetic. Number 4, she's skeptical. And this is just in less than a minute of screen time. We can also see that Angela takes steps away from James when telling him about the dangers of Silent Hill, and whenever he takes a step forward, she takes a step back. The only time she takes a step forward is when James doubts her, and even though we can't see her face from the camera angle, we can see she struggles to maintain eye contact with James and is constantly looking behind her as if expecting to be attacked. One other verbal oddity is that Angela refers to her mother as Mama, which she quickly corrects, and we also can see that she even points out that her looking for her family isn't James's problem. Like I said, all in a few minutes, and if we look at her posture after the dialogue, we can see that she even holds onto both of her arms with an uncertain posture. Now look, I'm open with my issues and have no problem saying this, but yeah, I do a lot of these verbal and physical tics myself, and yes, they do stem from abuse, and these traits are very common with individuals who lack self-esteem or trust in people. Holding your arms, pulling your hair, fidgeting with your hands, and other tics are very common in people who've experienced trauma or abuse in any form. In my own experience, I tend to hold my elbows, arch my back, look down, and talk slowly when I'm very stressed or anxious as yeah, I don't want others to see how I look, or I want to minimize myself from as much external stimuli as possible. It comes across better in my LPs rather than a script like this, but in my everyday speech, I've actually got a very structured and almost synthetic way of speaking because I also am constantly trying to find the right words to say, to not sound broken, and to emote as much as I can to mask my emotions if they're getting to me, or to show strangers in public I'm not a complete mess of a human being. I also generally don't view anything I say as important or worthwhile because I fear I'm constantly boring or uninteresting to others, so I tend to only speak when spoken to, and when I do, I have to give someone my full attention or I fear I'm doing something wrong and being judged. If anyone's curious, this is also why I don't plan or have interest in live streaming because I actually physically and mentally can't handle the ability to try and manage more than 1 to 2 conversations at a time with people. I get way too emotionally drained and worried every second. In regards to Angela constantly stepping away from James, this is also something I can sadly relate to. Angela is a victim of physical and sexual abuse, and yes, I also share this trait sadly, and as such she avoids physical contact and is in a state where she has to constantly check her surroundings at all times. I sadly do the exact same things, everywhere. Before the term social distancing was a thing in the public, I have been doing this for years, since I was a preteen. Anyone who knew me at younger ages can attest to this as well, and that I actually stand generally 12 or so feet away from people at all times, regardless of if I know someone or not. Once someone has been exposed to a physical trauma at the hands of another person, it's extremely difficult to honestly want to be near someone, and for me, that 12 or so feet is what I use to keep myself in open space if I need to get away from someone, and I also don't want to be in someone else's way because I see myself as lesser to others and in the way at all times. I do go out of my way to make eye contact with people when I'm talking, but the more stressed I become, the less likely I am to maintain it because I'll be too focused on whatever is in my mind and trying not to reflect my anxieties to the other person for fear of wanting them to help me. One final note here is that Angela also abruptly tells James that she's not lying about the possible dangers of the town, It's also worth pointing out that it's likely as a result of her trauma, forcing her to be confrontational and upfront after not being taken seriously in her youth. As horrible as it sounds, yes, I've been through this, and I can safely say I do tend to always verbally make the point that I'm being serious or that I'm not lying, even if it's a small thing, because so many people have doubted me in all aspects of my life. Moving on, the next encounter with Angela is in the apartments. In the room prior to her location, we can also see that the walls are painted a somewhat brownish hue, which I'll bring up later, and we can also see an abandoned teddy bear. Now, I can tell you're going to roll your eyes and go, "Now Seth, it's just a teddy bear." But I'd like to say, yeah, it is. No, in all honesty, I feel the teddy bear represents a loss of innocence and corruption of childhood, resulting in a want to be considered mature. You could ask, Seth, that's silly, what makes you think that? We see that Angela has already corrected herself from saying mama, and yeah, when I was younger, I actually coped with a lot of my abuse by trying to be mature and reject the idea that I was just a kid. It sounds weird, and maybe I'm not alone here, but I actually hated the idea of happy things as a kid because I was in so much emotional and physical pain constantly, day in, day out, that seeing things like toys and smiles actually made me feel bitter and resentful that I couldn't feel happy or comforted. Anyways, the next room contains one of my favorite moments in a game, with an awesome and well-directed shot of Angela staring at James from a mirror, holding a knife in a fetal position on the floor. We also hear that Angela finally introduces herself, and there's a drastic difference in her voice as opposed to her tone in the cemetery. She sounds far more distant, slow, and emotionless here, likely due to the town affecting her now that she's deeper into it and not on the outskirts. It's here that Angela says one of the most interesting things to James, that he's the same as her, and it's what they deserve. Obviously James would deny this, but she is correct. The two of them both have committed murder, and they technically feel they need to be punished or tormented for committing such acts. Yet, Angela's idea of deserving hell is more of something ingrained into her from her own mother, as she explains later on. I also really love how she mockingly asked James if he's afraid because, well, she wasn't wrong. James was afraid to own up to his issues and afraid to accept that he had done something atrocious. We see that she does quickly apologize for her snide remark, but becomes defensive when James asks about her mother and if she lived in the town or not, even dodging his question about why she came to Silent Hill in the first place. Angela does manage to direct things back to James, but when he shows her his photo of Mary, Angela reacts by simply apologizing and shaking her head awkwardly. When James points out that Mary is dead, however, Angela actually raises the knife a bit towards him and becomes visibly defensive once he turns to face her, even gripping the handle a bit, and this is likely why she chooses to stand up and try to leave the room for fear of James being dangerous. Also notice how she never once turns her back to him in this entire scene after she stands up now that she's been alerted. After she persuades James to leave her alone in the town, she asks him to take the knife from her, and I can see why this scene makes people question why she reacts the way she does, and I can safely say it's something subtle, and mainly a camera issue. In the shot prior, we can see that Angela was walking towards the middle of the wall, probably to put the knife on the table with the coin, but James had actually stepped towards her a bit more and cut off that corner of the room, leaving her likely to feel trapped as he took another step towards her to grab the knife. It could also be the town manifested James as her father or some sort of monster, as we'll discuss later, but I think it's more than likely the former. Regardless, Angela puts the knife down and leaves the room to presumably go back to her own quest in the town. Like I mentioned earlier, Angela clearly doesn't want people to be near her, and it's sadly understandable. I can see why someone could confuse why she reacts more negatively and frightful when she stands up, as opposed to when she had her back to James in the start of the scene, but I think it's mainly because up to this point, Angela didn't see James as anything more than just a person and had no reason to fear him until he points out that his wife is dead, implying to her that he was not only single, but that he might have killed her. This likely caused her to feel vulnerable and afraid for possibly exposing herself to him earlier in the scene, now that she knew he could have had an ulterior motive. I will say I rarely ever expose my back to people I don't know. It's 100% animal instinct in me at all times. I don't even like giving people a handshake, and it's been years since I've even given someone a one-armed hug. The less exposure I have to strangers or people I don't know well, the better. I also am terrified of exposing my emotions to people even if I know them, because I trust people so little, and I know I can be manipulated from kindness due to my emotional instability. I rarely will ever tell people what's bothering me because I don't want to be baggage, and I don't ever trust if someone is being truthful or not, and will totally jump to conclusions about someone in seconds, even if I've known them for years, because my mind is genuinely in a constant state of decision making and threat assessment. In regards to Angela's voice suddenly being more down, I think anyone with a depression disorder can understand this sensation. When you're hit with something unpleasant or painful, or even just something small chipping away at you, you will eventually crash emotionally and go into a low state where you no longer care, feel much of anything, and your perception almost feels fogged over. Like a state of emotional indifference, I guess, but there's not a very clear way to describe a low state unless you've been there. I feel before James found Angela, she likely experienced a manifestation like with Eddie earlier, and she went into the room to self-isolate. It's uncertain whether or not Angela self-harmed prior to entering the town, but I think the knife was more symbolic of a want for suicide rather than harming oneself, as the start of the scene shows her staring at the blade, not using it, and the mirror imagery, which is totally awesome by the way, is likely there to remind her of her abuse and her thought of deserving it. It's common for trauma victims to think they deserve what they experienced, and as someone who's experienced these thoughts since adolescence, I think it's a way of internalizing and accepting what happened to you, but not correctly. It's easier to blame yourself because socially we're acclimated to not want to blame others for our misfortunes, when in reality, yeah, people fuck other people over a lot, and you might genuinely have had no say in the matter. I can comfortably say that I'm responsible for a lot of my own issues, but I still happily say that about 2/3 of my issues are from other people and 1/3 is actually my own fault. I can tell someone can say, wow, how dismissive and irresponsible, but trust me, when I was 15, I wanted to swallow a bottle of Xanax and Zoloft with a bottle of Tylenol and drown myself in a creek because I felt my issues were all my own fault. Yeah, you can say you deserve pain or death, but ultimately when done correctly, it's infinitely better to be introspective and understand what actually harms you. Sometimes it is yourself, and sometimes it's others, but rarely will you being dead actually do something helpful. Healing isn't fast, and it may be painful to admit you were at fault for something, but you'll feel a hell of a lot stronger and become a better person for moving on. A final note of this scene is Angela's reaction to James showing her a picture of Mary, which she simply apologizes towards. It's subtle, but when you're depressed and dissociated, you tend to ignore other people's problems and pains and simply focus on your own thoughts and needs. I tend to do this when I'm falling apart inadvertently, but it's as a result of my OCPD, which causes me to focus on only a few specific things at a time and try to find solutions. I'll still absorb some information in that moment, but I won't be able to properly digest it, and it really is a pain in the ass because someone like me generally does have a ton of empathy, but at times I can sadly only focus on what ails me sometimes. Our next encounter with Angela is in the labyrinth, and this one may be the most devastating. Outside the abstract daddy boss fight, we can find a newspaper that details the murder of Thomas Orozco, Angela's drunken and violent father. The paper clues us in on the fact that he was stabbed to death and that the murder weapon wasn't found, which leads us to assume that the knife Angela has been carrying was actually a murder weapon and not a tool of self-harm. If it isn't obvious yet, yes, Angela murdered her father, likely from the pent-up rage from her sexual and physical abuse, and this is why the town of Silent Hill drew her to it. I'll be covering the abstract daddy in totality in the enemies section of the analysis, but for now, let's discuss the room that this encounter takes place in. If it wasn't obvious, the walls are of what appears to be flesh and covered in holes with metal tubes pumping in and out, and are symbolic of sexual abuse. There's a TV next to the area where Angela is sitting, and if I had to guess, it was displaying something that only she could see in that moment, or it was likely just there as part of the room's background. We see that Angela is in a sitting position with a look of panic and fear, and she doesn't seem to react to James or the abstract daddy, which yes, this is actually pretty normal for someone who's undergone actual PTSD or CPTSD. Angela is in a state that I've experienced too many times in my life, and no matter how many times it happens, and no matter how much you think you can prepare or handle it, this is what it actually looks like to be triggered. Despite the meme of saying it and idiots wanting to say it to try and get sympathy points, actually being triggered by something results in a total collapse of self, surrounding, and movement, almost as if you're in a nightmare and you can't wake up. I may not be a doctor, but I can safely diagnose Angela with having CPTSD, which is what I actually mainly suffer from. There is a difference between PTSD and CPTSD if you're curious. PTSD is mainly fear responses after a traumatic event like a car crash, and can be overcome and eventually have its severity fade with therapy and proper treatments. CPTSD, however, is short for Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and the complex of the name is added from factors such as repeated exposure to the same trauma or numerous traumas committed for years at a time. The symptoms are much more long-lasting or even permanent, and can lead to comorbidity with things like insomnia, paranoia, dissociation, suicidal thoughts, and everything nasty you can add. I'm not ashamed to admit it, but as someone who suffers from this, I experience mood shifts, insomnia from fear, severe bouts of emotional self-hatred and regret, a totally obliterated short-term memory, existential breakdowns, and I actually don't have the ability to feel pleasure or pride properly, which results in positive emotions turning to guilt or loathing because I'm so used to pain and abuse that I actually don't know how to feel happy or safe. This scene of someone just vacantly staring off is the most accurate way to describe what millions of people like myself have experienced. A total lack of control. This, like I said, is what triggered actually looks like. This is why people like me have an actual certified ESA. This is why people like me have to take medications to not feel sick and ill with themselves. This is one of the most impactful moments in fiction, and it's just a damn shame that some people would rather have watered-down, spoon-fed, and pussy-footed examples through things like pop culture and children's entertainment to avoid the honest-to-God reality of what someone like me suffers with every day. I don't want someone to experience this scene, fuck no, but in reality I wish people actually understood what an emotional breakdown was, what it feels like to the victim, and how it's not just some on-off switch that we're in control of. Moving on, after James kills the abstract daddy, Angela quickly snaps into an emotionally fueled rage and beats the hell out of the monster's corpse. When James tries to tell her to relax, she immediately switches into a more hostile and confrontational stance, culminating into her accusing James of being after sex because of his kind behavior towards her so far. She eventually collapses to the floor in a mess and continues to berate James, going as far as to say she knew about him and that he didn't want Mary in his life anymore. Whether or not she made this decision based on her own deductions or by the town forcing her to this conclusion, I'm kind of on the latter, but I feel the town pushed her already pre-existing phobias of men and sex to the point that she no longer could trust or care about James. Angela's behavior in this scene is 100% in line with victims of sexual and physical abuse, and what I also go through at times when put under immense amounts of pressure. It's the only way I can explain it. You don't feel anything except maybe hits of fear and shock, and yes, when in an actually emotionally volatile state like this, you can totally blank out entire segments of your memory and react 100% on pure impulse and even pass out from sensory overload. There are totally times when I've snapped at people for telling me to calm down despite the fact I felt totally in control of my emotions, and after an episode of shock, I almost always am extremely hateful and full of self-guilt and repressed anger. There's a disturbing bit of clarity in these moments almost every time where I feel I'm fully aware of what I'm saying and doing, but my emotions and morals slip and I could honestly give a shit less what someone's saying, helpful or not. I want to explode. I want to stop being civil because all it does is make me feel vulnerable and exposed. You feel like a cornered animal and your mind will totally blank out what's right and wrong as long as you can get the hell out of the situation you're in. It's absolutely horrifying, not just for me, but for everyone around me, because nearly everyone in my life knows how much of a facade my actual public appearance is. Underneath that nervous half smile I show people every day, underneath all that black I cover myself in, underneath all the apparent collectiveness and stoicism in my mannerisms and philosophy, I'm a broken man. I'm a scared, vulnerable, and impulsive animal, and I know it. All it takes is the wrong thing to happen to me for too long, and I'll break down into that part of me that I try so damn hard to conceal every day. It doesn't matter if I have therapy or medications, I'm always going to be that way. And even though the chances of me actually getting to the point of breaking down are low, and I'm actually conscious enough to not ever harm anyone or myself, there's a part of me that always knows something sad. That pain may fade, but it's something I can't forget. I hate to show people me at my most vulnerable. It's inevitable in any relationship, friendly or more, and it's actually a reason I don't like to get close to anyone, period. I'm always afraid of what they might think of me when they inevitably see me fall apart and realize I'm not really all there like they might have thought. When you get home from shopping with your family having a good day, how do you handle coming home to your loved one curled in a fetal position, hyperventilating, shaking and saying, "I'm sorry," over and over and over, because it's the first time he's had a Thanksgiving in almost a decade and the emotional joy was too much for him and caused him to realize his family is totally fractured and non-existent? How do you help someone who's aware they can't be helped? You just can't. That rage that burns in someone like me, or anyone who's been harmed mentally or physically, is something that honestly is impossible to ever let go of, and will almost always go in this exact cycle demonstrated here. Prepare, exposure, shock, anger, guilt, retreat, recover, repeat. This is the honest-to-God reality of what it's like for millions of people every day, and why I developed obsessive-compulsive disorders that worsened into a totally rigid, painful, and stringent personality. To combat and prevent my past life and mistakes to keep haunting me through constant mantras, distractions, and social behaviors. Minimize the risks so the next hit won't hurt as much, and learn from each failure to prove you won't let it happen again. It all sounds kinda good, right? Yeah, I'd like to say I've made a hell of a lot of progress in the past decade of my life after high school, but it's also forced me to miss out on so many things. I avoided friends to prevent them from worrying about me. I chose work over family to prove I was a capable and dedicated person. I ignored medication and therapy because I wanted to prove to everyone I was above it. I fucked myself up so I couldn't have anyone else to blame but myself. Obviously, I don't engage in this mindset anymore because it's very unhealthy, but I find myself slipping into it because it's extremely easy to do, and I can safely say from experience, if you find yourself doing things just to prove a point to someone or something else, stop. I regret so much of my life because of actions like this, and I can also reassure you, spite and anger is not the correct way forward, and you'll feel nothing but emptiness if you live life like that. It's not wrong to be angry or avoidant to a certain extent, but use those emotions in a constructive and positive way to move through pain and actually better yourself. Either way, our final and most impactful moment with Angela is right before the final fight with the Pyramid Heads. We see her standing on a staircase while gazing at a decoration, and she confuses James for her mother, who she totally calls Mama at this point, even going as far to grab James's face affectionately until she realizes who he is. She apologizes but reluctantly thanks James for saving her from earlier, from what I assume is the abstract daddy, but Angela adds a very grim and sorrowful, "but I wish you hadn't," even going as far as to bring up the fact her mother said she deserved her abuse. Thankfully, James is an ultra Chad and tells her it's not true, but Angela lays down one of the most impactful moments in any piece of media I've ever seen to this day.
Or maybe you think you can save me. Will you love me? Take care of me? Heal all my pain? That's what I thought.
Just fuck everything about this. The voice acting, the camera placement, the music, and the reality of this moment. This right here is the moment of Silent Hill 2 that made me realize I could make this analysis series. Like, yes, I was influenced by some of my viewers and friends in real life, but this scene and how much it impacted me is why I was able to so naturally and articulately even write this entire script in less than a few weeks of solid work. It's perfect. No amount of graphical fidelity, no amount of high-budget voice acting, and no amount of extra set dressing is needed to make this scene more beautiful and somber. The way the camera is facing Angela as if it's from a first-person perspective really adds to the power, as if she's literally talking down to James and how he backs down. It's always stuck with me, and the art that is meant to evoke genital manipulation is just haunting. I've often been asked by people my entire life why I find so much beauty in depressing and painful things. This is why. There's so much in this entire scene that lasts for just a few seconds that encapsulates what I've struggled with every fucking day for over 20 years. Once you've been broken and abused, you will always feel tainted and sick, and that nobody will ever truly help you. You feel a sense of deep, indescribable self-loathing that you think you're better off alone, or like everyone is suspect and out to repeat what's been done to you. Yet, you feel this pull in your heart for a want to love, a want to let your guard down, and a want to be able to trust again. You'll feel a desire to want to be like everyone else, but you know you can't, ever. You'll want to reach out for someone to protect and hold you and make you forget all the evil things that's been inflicted on you, but you'll have that loathing come back. You'll think of what's been done to you and you'll shudder and feel sick, and soon that feeling of want turns into something of pure disgust. And you reflect on everything you've been through, and you'll grapple with this until your mind breaks or you pass out from anxiety. It never ends. There's a reality to Silent Hill 2's portrayal of the mentally ill that I've never really seen portrayed in any other media, and it's also what happens next. Angela demands the knife back from James, but he refuses, and she turns her back to him. She climbs the stairs, and is never seen again. In my mind, Angela either dies after this moment, or is doomed to repeat and relive the traumas that the town inflicted on her forever. Barring the supernatural elements of the story, this is incredibly realistic. I said in my LP I view mental illness as neither black nor white. It's gray. There is never ever a good or bad ending to someone like Angela's story. Even if the bad guys are put in jail or killed or whatever, what's done to you is done to you. How you live life after this is never easy. Getting therapy, taking medication, and admitting your faults and trying to move on? Fuck, if it was easy, the world would be a fantastical place. I may have cut so much out of my life, like abusive family members, friends, bad habits, and whatever, but I always have the scars to remind me physically and mentally. You can always say it's so easy to cut a family member out until you actually do it, and then you realize you've lost something like your parent who brought you into this world, and all the memories you have of them will never cease. You can brutalize someone who harmed you out of some sense of vengeance or imprison someone who wronged you, but you won't forget. And if you're like me, you have the thought of, what if they come back? Or, will they find me somehow later in life? Sometimes you'll think the closure you have with a person will be interpreted wrong, and maybe someone's friend group lashes out at you, or creates even more problems than before. Reality is gray. Every action has a reaction. Every person has the ability to change, but not everyone actually will. In Angela's case, I feel she was too far gone, too deluded, and not given enough of a chance to be saved or helped. Like I said, barring the supernatural elements, I've met too many people like her, people that are so mentally broken and unable to move on that it really isn't their fault they are the way they are. I may have a lot of reasoning in what sounds like strength, but a lot of that is just luck. I used to be a self-abusive, nihilistic cynic who wanted the pain to end because my perception of life and reality was so far removed from any sense of purpose or joy that I felt I only hurt those around me simply by existing. The only reason I'm still alive is a combination of luck and the sheer will not to let go for the ones I love and care about. Some, they're not so lucky, and that's the reality of life. That's the reality of depression. That's the reality of what it's like to be mentally ill. Your words, your actions, and your motives influence everyone around you, both positively and negatively, and whether or not you know it, everything you do matters in some way. It's not just some hippy-dippy mumbo-jumbo, no, it's called cause and effect. Yeah, there's such a thing as normalcy or good and bad, but as cliche as it sounds, the world is what you make it. Someone like Angela is an example of how some people will naturally refuse help or believe they're not worth saving because of their circumstances in life. You start to see the world in a twisted and perverted way, living on fear and instinct and acting on vengeance and anger. The fire she feels and sees, to me, is reflective of both abusive pain and also the burning hatred one feels for themselves, both for themselves and the world. Angela's version of Silent Hill that James can witness is a world of reliving sexual and physical torment with hallucinations of her family, the ones who harmed her, trying to force her to stay in the never-ending cycle of self-hatred, submission, and fear. Her mother is who she wants to prove wrong for her belittling and downplaying of her abuse, and it's entirely likely that if she hadn't fled to Silent Hill, Angela would have murdered her out of revenge as well. Angela never understood what the town was showing her, and her self-doubt and lack of self-esteem despite James's genuine attempts at helping her makes me come to the conclusion she was too far gone once she had delved deeper into her own mind. I'd like to think that she could change, it's possible for anyone, but wanting or knowing how to change was the real problem. Regardless of if the town was real or not, her crime was still unforgivable. Blood for blood. There's been many nights I've spent awake wondering if I could extract revenge with zero consequence on those who wronged me, even for the most petty of things. I'd still not act on it. It's just not the right thing to do. If I was able to take back any of my past mistakes I've made in life or retract any painful events in my life, I really wouldn't. I may not have had a real childhood or had a functional family, but I wouldn't trade it to someone else. And all that shit I went through, good or bad, made me a humble, selfless, compassionate, empathetic, and real person. It's not every day that someone can actually say they care or they know and actually mean it. It may have come at the cost of much of my innocence and decency with long-lasting scars, but I'd rather tell someone I may not be in the same boat as you, but I've definitely been in the water. To me, Angela represents an aspect of James's inability to move on and seek help, and the dangers of living life in a deluded and fear-driven manner. She, like Eddie, is also a byproduct of the depravity of other humans. Likewise, James's suffering is one brought on from the unfairness of mortality and the uncaring nature of diseases and illness. This is why I say that Silent Hill 2's characters appeal to me. They're fictional, but obviously they represent us as a species very easily. We all suffer. Whether we care to admit it or not, we are all capable of acts of cruelty or violence, driven by motives that we think are the right thing to do. The characters don't have superpowers. They don't abide by corporate pandering or tokenism. They're human. Almost too human in that anyone can see them and not think anything of them if they were actual people, and you don't even consider that they might carry some deeper baggage. Someone like me you can look at and kind of draw some pretty obvious conclusions about me, like I was probably bullied in my youth, or that I don't sleep well, or that I'm into music or art. But you'd never know that I've actually had to hide in the corner of a room with a baseball bat because I was anticipating a drugged up stalker to try and attack me from the room over, or that I've had to live the first 24 years of my life with the idea that my life was out of necessity for someone else to survive and I wasn't wanted. Look at someone like James, or Angela, or Eddie, and honestly ask yourself this question. Could I end up like them? The sad truth is, everybody can be like them, at any time, at any point. But we all have the ability to change who we are. It's never easy and it's never quick, but every one of us, no matter what, can change. All it takes is one step, one day at a time, and always, always, always know you're not alone. You may think you're small, and you know what? You are, but that's not a bad thing on a cosmic scale. Time is finite. Life is short. Yet, that doesn't mean that your life is useless. It doesn't mean you're weak to feel upset or depressed. Your path in life, just like mine, will have bumps and twists, turns, and steep hills that never seem to end. But there's always a reason to keep going, whether you know it or not. The name comes from the legend of the people whose land was stolen from them. They called this place the Place of the Silent Spirits. By spirits, they meant not only their dead relatives, but also the spirits that they believed inhabited the trees, rocks, and water around them. According to legend, this was where the holiest ceremonies took place. But it was not the ancestors of those who now live in this town that first stole the land from these people. There were others who came before. In those days, the town went by another name, but that name is now hopelessly lost in the veils of time. All we know is that there was another name, and that for some reason, the town was once abandoned by its residents. So we've talked about the game, the story, and the characters, but we haven't talked about what you're going to be interacting with the most in Silent Hill 2, the monsters and the town itself. Let's start with the town, shall we?
You know what I heard? This whole area used to be a sacred place. I think I can see why. It's too bad we have to leave.
I already read a brief description of the town's history from the collectible item, the Book of Lost Memories, found at the Texan gas station in A New Game Plus. What fascinates me about this text is that it gives a lot of detail about Silent Hill's history, but also, well, it leaves a lot to be imagined. Now, for the most part, the town of Silent Hill is generally accepted to be somewhere in Maine. As far as I know, geographically, Toluca Lake, the lake that sits in the middle of the town, isn't actually in Maine, but rather California. If we go from the text that's given to us, the native tribes that are mentioned would have been of the Wabanaki nations that would have encompassed tribes like the Maliseet, the Mi'kmaq, Penobscot, and the Passamaquoddy. I mention the native tribes because almost all the tribes of North America had a deep respect for the world they lived in, and to those who walked the continent thousands of years ago, their day-to-day life wasn't just about hunting and gathering, but family, art, music, and the spiritual world. While each tribe was different, yeah, it should be noted that most tribes in North America have creation stories that generally depict humans as coming from nature, not nature coming from humans. And it's very common that most tribes believed in not only a creator entity, but also a malevolent one. Nothing in this world was basic or simple to the First Nations that existed before European colonization, and things like trees, rivers, and animals all meant something to some extent. This, to me, is why the text from the Book of Lost Memories really does lay down a very important ground rule for the mythology and origin of Silent Hill, the town, and the series. In my mind, I feel it's possible that because of European invasion the land became cursed, due to the assimilation and decimation of the Wabanaki nations, or it's likely that the area was always a spiritual hotbed before anyone even claimed the area as a home. Regardless, the town would eventually become plagued with practitioners of the occult, fucking black metal kids, numerous violent crimes, and even seemingly supernatural anomalies like a boat full of tourists on the lake going missing without a trace. The town of Silent Hill just seems ambiguous, and I personally love that because, well, it doesn't need explaining. It's like Zen and Half-Life in that, yeah, you can raise questions about it and how it came into existence, but the fact that it exists is already weird itself, and it probably can't be explained by rational logic or science. Silent Hill to me is neither good or evil. It simply exists as a place that's trapped in a state of mainly evil that can be bargained with or manipulated based on each person. The general consensus is that Silent Hill has different realms to it that all overlap in some way or another. There's the normal world of Silent Hill that has day-to-day life going on at all times. Then there's the fog world, which sort of bends the lines of reality by showing monsters, the famous fog that trademarks Silent Hill games, and some unsettling imagery. Continuing from there, we get the other world, or other side, where it's a distorted and ghastly version of the normal world, with much more monsters, and the rules of reality start to break further. You can make the point that the deeper one goes into the other world, both literally and metaphorically, the more distorted and warped things become. Whether or not these deeper depths are considered their own realms is up to debate, but to me, I feel these depths represent the more darker and repressed portions of individuals, similar to the iceberg metaphor of the mind. I don't think that I can adequately explain how the town functions, and I don't think anyone truly can give a 100% definitive answer because it was designed to not have an easy or simple answer. The town is whatever the person in it needs it to be. A tourist attraction, a hiding place, or a place of punishment. It just depends on the individual. Speaking of individuals, let's talk about some monsters. Now, I'm not the first person to throw these theories and interpretations onto the table, mind you, but I think Silent Hill 2 is some of the most downright unsettling monsters in the history of horror. There's something viscerally disgusting and unnerving to the monster design of SH2 that really, I don't know, maybe it's my own personal taste, but there's something dirty and grungy and abstract about these things. Designed by Masahiro Ito, the monsters of SH2 roam the many halls, buildings, and streets of the town and its various planes of reality. While there isn't a huge monster variety, the sheer number of monsters that populates the areas is quite impressive, with the outdoor areas of the game sometimes housing dozens of mobs on screen at once. Every monster clearly has a lot of love and detail put into their putrid appearance, which not only makes them easy to recognize from a distance, but also shows that their design aren't just a mishmash of random horror elements thrown together. It should be no surprise that the town of Silent Hill manifests its environment and inhabitants to suit its, humble guess. These manifestations take on the traits of a person's deepest fears or mistakes, and whether or not these monsters actually have a natural form is a fun thought experiment, really. We see that Eddie does say something about seeing some monsters when he first runs into James, but it's unlikely that Eddie sees the same manifestations as James. In the room prior to meeting Eddie, James can find a dead thing in a fridge, and later on in the prison section there's a corpse near Eddie. I mean, you could honestly argue that these are dead monsters from Eddie's phobias, but it's more than likely they're just remnants of that weird, unnatural energy that floats around the town. After all, as the text implies in the Book of Lost Memories, Silent Hill has had many names and many different inhabitants, long before European colonization. It's entirely possible that maybe, just maybe, there exists magic in the town that's not spelled with just a C, but a CK. So you know some serious shit went down at some point. To me, the monsters in Silent Hill as a whole are exclusive to each person, and their appearance and abilities are generated to affect just the person that conjured them. But there's some sort of implied overlap in terms of physical space. There's a few examples of this in the game that I think show this. One, we see that Laura doesn't grasp why James thinks the town is dangerous in the hospital, when to James, up to this point, he's been Quick Draw McGraw on everything that moves. 2, we see that Eddie doesn't know what James is talking about in regards to Pyramid Head, despite the fact that Pyramid Head isn't exactly subtle or quiet. 3, the boss fight with Abstract Daddy in the maze. These are just a few examples, of course, there's probably others you could infer, but I feel the point I'm trying to get across is that in some way the monsters are both existent and non-existent at the same time, and another parallel to this is in the Doctor's Journal memo. The other side perhaps may not be the best way to phrase it. After all, there is no wall between here and there. It lies on the borders where reality and unreality intersect. It is both a place close and distant. It's just my idea that the monsters are a result of malignant and corrupted spiritual energy, taking shape to suit each person, and when a monster dies, that energy just gets recycled back into the town to eventually take another form. Speaking of forms, I guess we might as well talk about those forms. The first monster James comes across in the town is the Lying Figure. The figure is a feminine humanoid-like creature wrapped in what looks like a straitjacket of its own skin. Starting at the feet, the figures have a pair of black boot-like appendages that seem to be cutting into the legs. The lower body is stained in some sort of blood or tar, and the rear of the figure is pronounced from what looks like underwear. The hands of the figure are bound together, almost like a straitjacket, and the middle of the torso is split open like a vulva or a mouth. The top of the figure's head is shrouded with the skin jacket and has a zipper where the mouth should be, as well as a gaping hole where the eyes should be. There also appears to be a slit in the side of the figure's head, which can be seen in the cutscene before the first Pyramid Head battle in the apartments. To me, I view the figure as a representation of James's hatred of seeing his wife bedridden, and the mental anguish it caused him to see her in her sickened state. The straitjacket design always struck me as being derivative of the butterfly motif that appears throughout the game, that's also mentioned in Mary's letter to James in the end. The figure's attack is simply to walk towards James and vomit some sort of acidic cloud out, which could be a metaphor of Mary's illness and medications causing her digestive system to fail. The sexualized theme, at least to me, has also always been a way of showing how truly difficult it was for James to see his wife as attractive from all her physical and mental degradation, and the twisted and tightened appearance could be symbolic of his guilt for still having sexual urges. The figure is probably the most common enemy in the game, and also possesses a unique ability to crawl and scuttle across the ground when they take near critical damage, making them show some sort of instinct to retreat. I also view this as not only something to unnerve the player from the sudden movement, but also give the idea that the figure is like an insect. weak, pathetic, and vulnerable. I actually spent my first few hours dodging and weaving around these things, treating them like the zombies in the early Resident Evil games, until I realized something. They don't even have hands. They can't grab James, and they barely present a threat at all. The next enemy is the Creeper. The Creepers are large insects, somewhat resembling a mix between a beetle and a cockroach, but, you know, fucking Texas size, baby. It's unlikely that the Creepers are actually part of James's subconscious, and likely are just part of the environment naturally. Creepers don't show up too often, and they tend to just follow preset paths to patrol up and down, and their main really interesting usage is in the Historical Society puzzle where they infect the room after the light dies. It's possible, I guess, they could represent disease and decay, as cockroaches thrive on waste of all forms in nature, but I still think the Creepers are the most natural of the enemy roster in the game, and are likely just there for shock value. Next is the mannequin. As the name implies, the mannequin is, well, a mannequin-like creature consisting of two lower halves of an everyday clothing mannequin. At first glance, you might also think that the mannequin is a perfectly mirrored design, but there are some differences. From the bottom, you can see that the mannequin has what looks like two shoes attached to the legs that show off the rear of the creature. The torso is dressed in a leotard, which also has a pipe coming out of the side, which is somewhat hard to see in-game due to the lighting. The top of the mannequin consists of two other legs that seem to resemble leg braces, but with no feet attached. The mannequin is likely a representation of James witnessing his wife lose mobility due to her illness, and the pale appearance of the mannequin's body could also be a metaphor for the cold and sterile environment of the hospital that Mary stayed in. The fact the creature is also just legs could be a result of James's warped sexual feelings, and maybe I'm extrapolating too much here, but I've always felt the mannequin could be interpreted as James wanting to dress Mary as something else or replace her, as the first appearance of a mannequin is when James takes the flashlight from the display containing Mary's outfit. Mannequins aren't a very high threat, as they can only swing their, arm legs in a gangly fashion, but their main advantage is that they can actually cloak themselves from the radio static that gives away other monsters, if they're standing completely still. This is used a few times in the main game, but extensively in the side campaign, and is a great mechanic for catching new players off guard. Oh boy, here we go, the Bubblehead Nurse. So cool, it's everyone's favorite trashy cosplay costume. The nurses are enemies that show up in, you guessed it, the bowling alley. No, in the hospital section of the game. The nurses are probably one of the most overused enemies in all of Silent Hill media, but for a good reason. They're iconic, eerie, and dangerous. The nurses wear what look like stylized heels with bare legs. Their main outfit is a smock that exposes their cleavage and thighs, topped off with a traditional nurse's cap. The head of the, Bubblehead Nurse is swollen and almost featureless, save for the faint indication of eyes and a nose with a red square taking place of where the mouth should be. There is some difference between the Otherworld nurses and the Fogworld ones, but it's not really that drastic to be honest, and it's mainly just a cosmetic thing. The nurses likely represent James's dislike towards the hospital staff that took care of Mary, as the term bubblehead is a derogative term to call someone stupid, similar to calling someone an airhead. The swollen nature of their heads could also represent the way that James suffocated Mary, which could also be why the nurses have red squares on their faces to remind James of what he did. The sexualized aspect of the nurses could represent James's sexual tensions, but also the possibility that James could have viewed Mary's female staff members as more attractive. It's hard to tell on the latter, but the former, yeah, check out those pipes, man. Yeah, the nurses are probably the most dangerous enemy in the game, especially in hard mode, because that pipe can knock your fucking teeth out, and the speed of these monsters is actually very deceptive.
Laura?
Okay, I guess I won't open it. I think I'll just leave you like this.
You snotty little brat! Open up!
On to our first boss monster. Cool, now we can start grinding for pets. The flesh lips are only encountered once in the game before the first Outer World shift. They're a fairly abstract monster at first glance, but I think that's what makes them so memorable. At the bottom we have two dangling legs donning thigh-high boots grafted into a large wad of decaying flesh that looks like a mattress. Between the legs is a hole that has a mouth protruding from it, giving the boss its titular fleshy lips. At the tip of the weeb pillow is actually an arm that holds the monster in place to the ceiling. The flesh lips could represent Mary's entrapment to her bed, as the frame of the edge of the monster could be considered both the edges of a bed frame and a cage. The decaying appearance of the mattress's skin could also be symbolic of a deathbed, as Mary constantly points out she's afraid to die, and James also euthanized her in a bed. The lips could be interpreted as vulva imagery, but I think they could also be viewed as a metaphor for how James suffocated Mary, as the main way the flesh lips attacks is by throttling James and pulling him towards its mouth. For the whole game, you only fight 3 of these things, and as far as threat level goes, the flesh lips only has 3 attacks, all of which are fairly easy to avoid if the player keeps their distance and wrangles properly, like the true rootin' tootin' cowfolk you are.
Yeehaw!
Next is a very obscure enemy, but my favorite of all the standard enemies in the game, the Mandarin. The Mandarin is a pretty cool design, but it's very hard to observe as they move very quickly, only show up in 3 places, and the game doesn't give you a very good way to look at them. These enemies are a mishmash of both the flesh lips and bubblehead nurse in terms of appearance. They have dangly legs and wear what looks like a dirty dress. The most noticeable feature is the ridiculously long cylindrical arms that end with lips, which contain black tentacle-like tongues. The Mandarin's head starts out shaped like a normal human head, but then tapers out into just a mouth. It's hard and vague to tell what these monsters mean symbolically, as they're used sparingly, and so everyone's opinion is going to vary greatly on this one, I feel. To me, the Mandarin represents James's inability to forgive himself and let go of his guilt, as they're only seen hanging from fences above nothingness, which could be seen as the unknown consequences for his wife's murder. The lips on their hands could be sexually related, or they could also be similar to the flesh lips' mouths in that they represent suffocation, which is why I think they better represent not letting go of guilt for fear of falling into the unknown of moving forward in life. I to this day have never bothered killing these creatures because, well, I feel they're better as a background storytelling device for what's going on inside James's mind. To be fair, they also show up in very inconvenient spots, like the Pyramid Head section of the Labyrinth, the very end of the game, and a transitional space between the hospital section and the park trek. There's just, I don't know, I feel bad if I killed them. Before we go into the last few bosses in the game, there's also one enemy that's worth noting before we move on. The prisoners. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it takes a lot to scare me or get under my skin because I'm a fucking goth and my soul is unspookable. Yet, my first time playing the game, I had no idea of these things, like, at all. The first time I encountered these enemies, I actually had my hair stand up on end because, well, they're creepy, man. In the prison section of the game, you can easily miss the first prisoner as he's in a room that's already full of enemies, and the music is already going to be playing by default. I'm going to go on the assumption that the average player is going to be experiencing the second prisoner first because, well, fuck you, I'm just going to assume everything about you. I'm not going to lie, the reason this scene got to me so hard is because every monster in the game up to this point hasn't made any signs of communication with James other than the sound of their brains being turned into hamburger helper or some agonized scream. To hear a monster that you can't see say something, that's spooky, man. Don't even try to deny it. There's a lot of speculation that the prisoners are saying ritual, which I can get behind. Now admittedly, I find the next community theory a bit of a stretch. Some people think that the monster's line of ritual is saying "Are you sure?" backwards. Now, why do I say that's a stretch? To be real, I work with ambient audio, and my whole musical roots stem from backmasking songs and sounds. There's an old debunked theory that everything we say has always got some darker meaning behind it, like "I love you" when spoken, and then played in reverse has some cryptic evil message in it, but that's just not true. Firstly, every person says words different. Anyone who knows me in real life can confirm I say weird shit all the time, and it's because I have a slight lisp and a nervous stutter. Let's do a little experiment here with the ritual and "Are you sure?" audio to prove that the theory's wrong. So here's me saying ritual normally. Ritual, 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 reversed. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. Now let's add some fun filters to be TikTok famous. Ritual, 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 and reversed. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. Now, the other reason I find this theory bunk is because, well, let's not beat around the bush. The game was made in Japan, and not everyone there speaks English as a first language. The likelihood that this whole audio file is also just spooky gibberish, it's entirely possible. Oh yeah, that's right, the prisoners. The prisoners are actually unique in that James doesn't physically see them, but he can tell where they're at in the cells and shoot them. They make pain sounds and they die, but they also pose zero threat to the player. I still think I wanted to include them because, to me, the prisoners are just a part of Silent Hill being, well, Silent Hill. It's not normal, it's beyond reality, and these two guys don't need a reason or backstory. They're like the bathroom thing that sounds like the scientist from Half-Life. Up next is a boss and normal enemy in the hotel portion, the Abstract Daddy. The Abstract Daddy is probably one of the most interesting debates among SH2 fans, and like I stated early on, I'm going to try and keep this in a vacuum and exclude things like translated tweets, developer afterthoughts, and things of that nature. I'm just going to play this like a bricked hand in Yu-Gi-Oh! And throw my cards on the table and leave in peace. So, the Abstract Daddy seems to resemble a mixture of two human forms trapped within a bed frame and wrapped in a blanket of skin. The top form is in a position where it's pushing down on the lower form constantly, with its hands and legs stuck through the bottom layer of the frame. The form on the bottom is less defined than the top, but it does have a slightly phallic shape with a pair of lips at the end. The underside of the creature also has a vulva-like slit in the middle that it can use to latch onto James. Now, what this monster means is going to vary greatly from person to person, but for me, I believe that Angela and James's version of Silent Hill seem to mesh together, probably due to the lower depths of the labyrinth causing some sort of hiccup in the town's energy. I say this because the meat locker scene with Eddie and the staircase scene with Angela towards the end of the game. Also, Angela brutalizes the monster's corpse, which to me signifies that yes, without a shadow of a doubt, she and James both saw the same manifestation and the room looked exactly the same for both of them. To me, the Abstract Daddy is a very overt and obvious metaphor for Angela's sexual and physical abuse at the hands of her father. The top figure represents a dominating male, and the bottom figure is a subdued and helpless female, clearly signifying sexual abuse. I also believe that the two monsters are trapped together, not just for the image of sexual coupling, but also to show that Angela's mind is forever warped and reminded of the abuse she received. I don't think that this monster could be fit for James's manifestations for a few reasons as well. Number one, all but one of James's manifestations are feminine and represent aspects of his wife's illness. Number two, the sexualized aspects of James's manifestations are subtle and not nearly as overt and violent as the Abstract Daddy. Number three, the monsters that James sees contains aspects of guilt rather than flat-out aggression. I also think the reason the Abstract Daddy even tries to fight James in the first place is because he intruded into the room. We see that the monster turns its attention from Angela to James as well. It's hard to tell from the shifting camera angles, but it does. The reason I feel it even picks a fight with James is because, Well, it's a monster and driven by its natural aggression and need for dominance. The reason I even go as far as to put so much detail into this enemy is because it seems to cause a lot of debate, mainly due to tweets from Masahiro Ito. In the year 2007 Jesus H. Christ, it's almost a goddamn decade since the game fucking came out. It's about as pointless as when J.K. Rowling made Dumbledore gay. There should be such a thing as fucking finality in fiction in this day and age. Outside sources should not influence a final product, especially decades after the product came out. That's bullshit, and deep down I can tell you're preparing your greasy sausage fingers to write up a vitriolic and neckbeardy response. But am I really wrong? Ask yourself. Honestly, ask yourself, am I wrong here? You know, I can imagine you thinking, "Ugh, Seth, you ugly subhuman, what the fuck do you know about storytelling? I've completed 2 fucking manuscripts, wrote fucking fiction since I was in the 2nd grade and taught creative writing. This fucking script you're hearing is a result of my writing skills and using my drama student skills to present it. Will I make mistakes? Fuck no, I'm perfect. But in reality, once this video is done, my words are done, my opinions are done, and the music I made for it is done. If I want to change my opinions down the line, it's possible, but guess what? This video is what it is. If I want to change something, I'll change it in editing, and not after. It's called integrity, and accepting something is finished. I don't give a good goddamn if Ito made the monster design. He didn't make the whole game. He may be the monster artist, but big whoop. Ito isn't Silent Hill 2, the product, and it bothers me because yeah, art's interpretive, but video games are a collaborative effort, and I'm in no way trying to rip on Ito. Fucking look at him, he's gorgeous. But I mean shit, dude. George Lucas didn't create the art, music, or set design for Star Wars. That fucker can't even settle on the correct pronunciation of a made-up bullshit alien he designed.
They all joined forces and everything, and the Gungas battle the droids in this huge kind of war and peace battle.
Mind you, Masahiro Ito is a fantastic artist, but come on man, you're really gonna sit there and say you regret making Pyramid Head when you still use it as your Twitter icon? Come on, get real and embrace the work you made, like Mike Matei with his eventual acceptance of Minecraft with Gadget. I think Ito would be a lot happier if he just deflated his ego. Then he could be like me, and just be a self-assured paranoid shut-in that swears at people for liking things he doesn't like. Moving far away from the topic of how much I can't stand Twitter and social media being used to stamp approval on decades-old art, let's talk about the most iconic, important, and analyzed monster that Ito designed, the big man himself, Axl Rose. Nah, just kidding, it's Pyramid Head. I don't think it's even fair to bring up Silent Hill 2, or the franchise for that matter, without mentioning Pyramid Head. I mean, look at him, he's got a pyramid on his head! In all seriousness, what makes Pyramid Head stand out is honestly his design. He's a mixture of the abstract as well as the familiar, and I think that really leaves a mark on his impact. If you look at classic horror film monsters, they stand out because they're a mix of abstract and familiar. Jason is just a dude in a hockey mask and a big knife. Freddy is just a dude in a Mr. Rogers sweater and some gardening tools. Leatherface is a dude with a skin mask and a logging tool. There really is a lasting power of doing something as basic as taking a person shoving something under their face and calling it a day. I mean, Slipknot did it pretty well. Pyramid Head's design consists of a standard physically toned male of a slightly taller height than James. He wears a very basic outfit of a dirty robe garment, some black boots, and what looks like surgical gloves. The most obvious feature is his sharp, pyramidal, metal helmet that adds a pained and awkward look to his posture and gait. Shockingly, Pyramid Head also has a worm-like tentacle that can come out from his helmet, but it's only used for a grab attack. Pyramid Head not only looks visually interesting, but he's also a standout amongst the monsters that James faces, as he appears to be the only male monster in the roster, and the only monster that seems to be actively engaging with James. It's easy to make some inference that the many monsters that roam the town seem to do so out of some aimless and animalistic matter, and only interact with James when he approaches them. Pyramid Head, on the other hand, seems to stalk James, always being one step ahead of him and being exactly at the right place at the worst possible time. James first sees Pyramid Head in the beginning of the apartment section of the game, and at first he's totally non-hostile and simply stares at James from the other side of the bars. I've always loved this scene as he's not holding a weapon, and James at this point doesn't even have a firearm, so this always stuck with me as Pyramid Head's non-verbal way of saying, I know who you are, and I want you to see me, so you know who I am. The next time Pyramid Head shows up in the apartments, James walks in on him assaulting and killing 2 of the mannequin enemies, which leads to him getting shot repeatedly after he senses James in the closet. Notice he also doesn't have a weapon yet, but he could easily overpower James if he wanted to, considering he also proves he can literally just shrug off numerous bullets from a handgun. I feel Pyramid Head didn't actually know James was there at first, but was at least semi-aware of him being in the room, just based on the fact that he starts to slow his movements and trail off as he drags the mannequin, with its twitching being the only thing to distract him at first. The fact he leaves the room always struck me as Pyramid Head saying to James, I know you see me, I know you're scared of me, you don't hurt me, but I can hurt you. Towards the end of the apartments, James also stumbles across Pyramid Head violating a lying figure, but this time Pyramid Head lifts up something dangerous and starts to attack, rather slowly, giving James just barely enough time and room to defend himself, until he eventually just stops and walks down the stairs towards the exit of the complex. I've always viewed this scene as Pyramid Head showing James that if he wants to keep pushing forward through the town, he has to push himself physically and mentally. If he wants any sort of resolution or answers, it's going to be an unpleasant experience. The handgun also is shown to not be able to outright kill or harm Pyramid Head, so I feel he merely was toying with James as if to say, you can't kill me, but I'm going to give you a reason to know I'm dangerous, and I'll fight back. Oddly enough, Pyramid Head takes a backseat to the game for a long time, until he shows up at the top of the hospital roof where he shoves James into a fence that leads him further into the area he needs to be in. I've always seen this as Pyramid Head's way of keeping James on the right track, and preventing him from screwing around or getting hesitant about his journey deeper into the town, and to show him, hey, I can show up anywhere, don't think I forgot about you. Shortly after James is reunited with Maria in the Otherworld version of the hospital, Pyramid Head shows up to pursue the 2 outside the elevator that will lead back outside. Rather than a knife, Pyramid Head chooses a much lighter but equally dangerous spear that he uses to impale Maria as she tries to get into the elevator. It's pretty obvious at this point, Pyramid Head doesn't actually want to kill or harm James and only keep pushing him further and further ahead, as there's clearly nothing stopping him from just thrusting his spear through Maria and into James. I've always viewed this action as, I can move faster than you think I can, and I can take things away from you if I feel like it. Once again, it's actually a very long time until James sees Pyramid Head again, and the next encounter is actually entirely optional in the labyrinth under the prison. Our geometric friend is seen patrolling around a section of the maze, and he still chooses to wield a spear this time, even allowing James to grab his knife weapon in the center room of the section he's patrolling. As this is optional, it's hard to interpret as maybe Pyramid Head was actually stuck in the maze due to Angela and Eddie causing the energy of the area to shift, and he's essentially just infinitely looping, looking for James until he can find out where he needs to be next. I'm not entirely sure if it's just the town's energy or Pyramid Head that kills Maria in the maze, but I feel like due to the more violent and sexual nature of 46 Tool Fan 2, it's more plausible that Maria's next death was done by the town to further torment and push James. At last, we come to our final encounter with Pyramid Head, this time in the hotel, where he executes Maria in front of James once he walks into the room. It's worth noting that there are 2 Pyramid Heads in this encounter, but I feel it's the same entity, just split into 2 halves to further challenge and break James's spirit. However, as James has finally embraced his guilt, accepted what he's done, and taken a stand to engage the conflict rather than avoid it, Pyramid Head realizes he's no longer needed and commits suicide. There's a lot of interpretation of what Pyramid Head is in regards to the mythology of Silent Hill, and where he fits amongst the pantheon of other named entities like Metatron, God, and the red or yellow gods. To me, and I'm going to break my vacuum rule for a minute, based on the seal of Metatron being used in the hotel arena, and the fact that Valtiel in SH3 has the symbol tattooed on his shoulder, it's likely that Pyramid Head is an underling or member of Valtiel's sect in the Order. Whether or not Valtiel is the Yellow God is up to interpretation, but regardless, I think Pyramid Head does serve Valtiel, and by proxy God. How high of a rank that Pyramid Head holds in terms of power, Who knows? There's no clear-cut way of determining this. But to me, Mathman might lie somewhere in the middle, as he's clearly not just some average thoughtless creature, but he doesn't hold enough influence as a being like Valtiel. What do I personally think Pyramid Head represents in the game? Well, it's gonna sound boring, but it's flat out said by James, the one who manifested him, that he needed someone to punish him for what he's done to Mary. Pyramid Head represents James's hatred for himself, his repressed sexual nature, and almost a mirror of what James thinks he is, a monster. Something evil. Something that skulks in the shadows. Something with no remorse or regard for life or limitations. I find it funny that James constantly reassures himself that he's not crazy or not like Angela or Eddie, despite the fact they're both correct about James in one regard. James is guilty, and he's committed a moral atrocity regardless of whether it was right or wrong. Pyramid Head, to me, doesn't represent some form of power fantasy that James wants to play out, but rather he simply reflects James's own psyche and wants to break him for whatever agenda the town has. Each time he shows up, it's always to push James into a state of acceptance with his actions and emotions by ramping up the stakes each time he shows up. Yeah, he leads him further into a town like a shepherd, but it's never to help James. I feel like, yes, I still stand by my idea that Pyramid Head is truly neutral and only acting on the town's energy and needs, rather than a force of evil or good. He's just a device used to break, torture, and destroy someone. How they react to his actions is up to them. I feel my theory for this stands up pretty well, because if you watch closely, when James stands to confront the two Pyramid Heads in the hotel after they kill Maria, you can see their posture is almost hesitant. And it's the only time in the entire game that Pyramid Head reacts with any visible uncertainty towards James. To me, when he stabs Maria again, the intended goal was to shatter James into a further state of disarray and agony to punish him endlessly and to make him eventually a thrall of the town and help achieve whatever God and the Order had planned. However, because James has accepted his actions and realized he can fight back, this naturally breaks the rules that Pyramid Head operates under, and once James continues to fight back non-stop, it creates a paradox of some sort, which, like I said, causes him to commit suicide out of desperation and realization, maybe to reconstitute as something else later on. I mean, this is all just what I think, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Masahiro Ito will tell me I'm a raging jackass and draws me as a monster for his own personal Silent Hill project. Regardless, I saved Pyramid Head for last because he really is a fascinating thing, not just as a monster, but as a concept for personal growth and acceptance. There's a very sad reality with mentally ill individuals like myself that will eventually show up at some point in time. Do you forgive yourself? Are you truly atoned for your past? Are you doing enough to make yourself a better person? I mean, shit, I face these issues every damn day. It's not a choice. These thoughts just manifest constantly when I'm by myself, when I'm driving, listening to music, not working on some project, and worst of all, when I'm dreaming. I can lie to people in public and say my day is fine and rattle off some boring conversational filler about my job, or I can smile and hold a conversation for hours with someone, but once I'm alone, with my thoughts, it's a different story. I live memories in my sleep of family members I said horrible things to when I was a teenager. I'll sit in my car and think of how friends I knew in high school might hate my guts for turning my back on them for a woman who didn't even ultimately care about me. I think about my time here on YouTube because, well, it's painful to think that I'm both lucky and unfortunate to have been preserved in this kind of in vitro state since coming back after I moved from my last home. I made videos and gained traction when I was 18, but now I'm 29 and I care about things like sub counts, drama, or trends. It's just not there. It doesn't exist. I can't feel it. I don't know how to feel it. Should I be happy? It's hard to convey this, but I do enjoy seeing my sub count go up, mind you. It shows a sign I'm hitting the right notes, but is it a punishment that regardless of how much I achieve or make, I don't feel anything half the time? Or is it a sign that I'm self-aware of the fact, well, none of it matters? It's a moral paradox as a creative person to want to achieve and do better constantly, when you know nothing ultimately matters and nothing I make will ever have the same integrity or drive I had when I was younger. I can't even begin to describe how I know my gift as a writer is a supplement for my destroyed psyche, and no matter how eloquent and rehearsed I sound in this series, I still have a lisp from drastic weight shifts as a teenager and my face being narrow. I still have a nervous and unnatural cadence to my voice because of OCPD and CPTSD forced my mind into a constricted and unnatural pattern. I'm not going to remember 3/4 of this entire project because my memory is so frayed and degraded from years of trauma that I won't be proud of it years from now, and I wish I'll never have made it at all. But is it a punishment? Do I deserve to feel a sense of pride or ego based on my life and my actions to others? Have I suffered enough and became selfless enough to allow myself to feel a sense of ownership to my skills? Well, to me, yes. And that's what makes Pyramid Head such a powerful character. I don't have to hide. I don't have to feel bad for being skilled at my crafts. I know that I make things for the benefit of others first and for seeing self-gratification last. I know that, and I accept it. And it's why I'm even making this series in the first place, to prove to myself that I can and do have the power to improve my love for analysis and writing, and I have everyone here to thank for that. And I really mean it. And thanks for watching. So, at long last, we end up at this point. The end. It's just a fact, man. Silent Hill 2 is such an incredible and long-lasting game that no remake, Netflix original series, or Hackney film can convey. There's a charm to this game and it sticks with you forever once you play it. You never forget it, and after you play it, it really does kind of sour your taste in other horror games, I feel, because it sets so many standards for not only the Silent Hill games, but horror as in, like, the whole genre. Yeah, we all know that Silent Hill is heavily inspired by other things like Jacob's Ladder, Stephen King, various surreal artists, but it's still 100% pure to its core and a unique experience as a piece of media. So many games take cues from this one, whether it be things like the Condemned series, or the Suffering titles, or even indie projects, commercial or not. Layers of Fear tends to come up quite a bit, but I'm a fucking old person and it's not from 1994 to 2012, so it's non-existent to me. However, I can pinpoint examples I have played, like Cry of Fear and Afraid of Monsters, which borrow tropes like monsters based on personality traits and phobias, otherworldly imagery, world shifting, and puzzles sewn from cryptic clues and environmental details. The use of Silent Hill 2 and 3's aesthetic of rust, blood, and decay are heavily present in the environments of these two Half-Life mods, as well as the use of chiaroscuro art techniques on the inventory and puzzle items in Cry of Fear. That's right, I fucking learned you some art. Seth was an art student. He knows the art. Hell, one of my favorite mods of all time for Doom, called Unloved, was my first exposure not only to the replication of Silent Hill 2's art style and presentation, but it was also my first exposure to the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2. Like, holy shit, I have to gush here for a minute because I've obviously been holding this back the entire analysis. Silent Hill 2's soundtrack is so fucking good. It's one of the greatest OSTs for anything, period, and I don't just say that because I've sucked this game off for so long. No, as a musician myself, it's truly masterful. The usage of acoustic guitar and letters that uses the same motifs and melodies as Promise, It fucking sends chills in me, man, and I love the wah-filled electric guitar notes really driving home in the feeling of inner reflection. The fact that Promise and Overdose Delusion share so much in common structurally but have wildly different guitar tones is just something I love, too. Overdose Delusion uses tremolo-like broken chords for the lead guitar, and has some fucking chunky and grungy power chords during the breakdown. Promise uses a much more alternative and dissonant lead guitar that crescendos into a bluesy-inspired solo. Just fuck! The ethereal and very iconic synth samples on tracks like Terror in the Depths of the Fog coincide so well with the other synth-infused tracks like White Noise, Blank Fairy, and Heaven's Night. Just fuck, these tracks are so amazing and mesmerizing, and it really adds to the charm of everything feeling dreamlike and lucid. I love the drum grooves in Heaven's Night, and especially in tracks like True. There's this off-tempo and sexy rhythm to tracks like Null Moon, with a subdued bass and drum beat, and Alone in the Town really shows off the power and versatility of proper hi-hat play. Like, god damn, these tracks are so juicy! I'm also a bassist first, yeah, but I'm also an ambient musician second, and if it isn't clear at this point for however long this series has been going on, I was heavily inspired by artists like Akira Yamaoka, Soichi Terada, Kelly Bailey, and Mark Morgan. Let's focus down Akira here though, because his usage of ambient sound is so damn gorgeous that I feel Silent Hill 2 wouldn't even be half the game it is without his soundscapes that add so much depth and immersion to the experience. Every track is used at the right time, for the right moods, and the right length of time as well, and it makes the game so much more memorable and emotional, and really complements the world design as well. Like, think about how every time Eddie is on screen, the music is ominous and tense. Every time Angela is on screen, the music consists of mainly piano and strings, with some somber melodies thrown in here and there. Lara's music tracks are gentle and more upbeat, matching her childlike innocence and wonder. James's tracks consist of primarily dissonant and cold synth soundscapes. Maria's themes invoke sexual undertones, relying on compressed or filtered bass and drum grooves and playful piano skills. Like, can you see why this soundtrack is so damn good? Anyways, yeah, Silent Hill 2 is just, it's so influential to horror and such an innovator in its own series. It's kind of like the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre film. Maybe I'm cheating a little bit here and have some bias since it's like, you know, my second favorite movie of all time. But seriously, think about it, and don't worry, if you've never seen the film, don't feel bad. Much, okay? You should. But, okay. So the original TCM was a film that came out at a time when the horror genre was relying on sex, gore, and jump scares. Most films of this era I can't even watch, not because I'm squeamish, but it's just gonna end up being a shit show of weird 70s schlock filled to the brim with as much uncomfortable shit as possible, just for the sake of it. Along comes a film with a budget as low as it could possibly get, with a unique premise. It's a horror film, yeah, but it's more psychological, right? We don't even see Leatherface until damn near 30 minutes or so into the film, and when he shows up, there's no scary music, there's no screaming, and there's no crazy imagery. It's just subtle and uncomfortable, and that music sting after he slams that door is so much more impactful to me than his overall presence, and it was clearly a deliberate editing choice. Most killers or monsters at this time in film were built up too dramatically, and with some subtlety, but their big reveal always feels frail to me since the tension and apprehension dissipates for the rest of the film afterwards. Consider the fact the movie also bills itself as a pseudo-urban legend with that badass narration at the start, which adds to the sense of reality and non-reality, similar to the Blair Witch Project, another favorite film of mine. Everything about this movie is just, it's nerve-wracking more than gut-wrenching, and it set up a lot of modern tropes. The crazy family unit, backwood cannibals or lunatics, wearing a mask of human skin, I mean, yeah, Ed Gein did it before it was cool, I know. The final survivor being a normal woman, and the use of non-gory gore, to name a few examples from the film. TCM was just a fucking juggernaut among the horror crowd, and I'm not a huge horror fan, because, well, this film spoiled it for me. I could talk for hours about just TCM and how great it is, but you see where I'm gonna go with this metaphor now? Every film after the original TCM was just, well, they're kinda shithouse if we're being real here. 2 is tonally goofy and batshit. 3 is just, well, it's something. 4 is, 5 is 2000's Edge with Arlie Ermy going ballistic, so yeah, just another day for the life of him. You see pretty clearly that every TCM after the first one was just a gradual decline, and the series never caught on in the way other horror mascots would, like Jason, Freddy, or George W. Bush Jr. did.
Now watch this drive.
They lost sight of what made the original special, or milked the tropes too hard, like trying to humanize the man with another man's face on his own, or the low-angle ass shot of the Sawyer house, the dinner scene, the final girl, you get the idea. Silent Hill as a franchise has never fully been able to stretch out of 2's shadow because, well, it's a fucking huge shadow, man. Think of all the things that Silent Hill 2 did for horror games at the time. A very clear lack of jump scares, an interesting and dark twist to the character you were playing, monsters based on internal strife, a monster that stalked and followed the main character covered in a spooky mask, multiple endings based on player choices throughout the entire game that weren't signposted. Every Silent Hill game after 2 had to incorporate these mechanics in some way or another to stay relevant, and it's not inherently a bad thing. I mean, why change what isn't broken, right? The problem is that Silent Hill as a franchise really couldn't commit much further past 3 and 4, and I know the Western games get a bad rep, but it's kinda justified, honestly. Silent Hill 3 is a good sequel to Silent Hill 1, and improves and builds off tropes and mechanics of 2. The Room, I've not played without friends around, but I do know of it, and yeah, it's unique, and it uses tropes and mechanics from 2 and 3, with a bit of ties to 2 and 3 stories. Once you get to games like Origins, Homecoming, and Shattered Memories, there's not much more you can really do with the series, right? Why keep throwing nurses into the games? Oh, Silent Hill 1 and 3 had them. Why keep making replicas of Pyramid Head or monsters similar in design? Oh yeah, Silent Hill 2 did it. Why have main characters that all have some hidden dark past? Oh yeah, Silent Hill 2 did it. Obviously, I've only played the first 3 games, so I don't feel qualified to be the judge of all the series, but as a creative person, I know when something is running on E. Shit, I would have been perfectly content having only 3 Silent Hill games and that was it. It's like for me as a big Mortal Kombat fan, I consider everything past Armageddon to basically be MCU levels of fucking awful in terms of story and handling of the franchise. The last good MK game was basically X, and it's just because the fighting engine was solid and the story was semi-competent. 11 just jacked off for modern brain-dead Tumblr dwellers and opened its legs to leeches who just absorb pop culture and can't actually play games for shit. That's right, I went there. Sue me, asshole. Keep trying to say Scorpion's name like he's your best friend and keep trying to defend Ronda Rousey's abortive performance. Doesn't mean shit to someone who's actually, played the game and not just regurgitated shit off of a wiki to look cool. Where was I? Oh yeah, Silent Hill. Silent Hill capped at 2, and to me that's fine. I don't want mediocrity. If I wanted it, I'd go and play a Resident Evil title and pretend the series was still good after 4. SH2 set such a high bar, and it's why it's still talked about almost 2 decades after its release, and why it's used in so many discussions about horror games and horror as a genre. It's like when you were in school and you had to read these things like Frankenstein, Catcher in the Rye, or Lord of the Flies. Those novels may be ancient, but they hold up. I mean, shit, dude, I've read the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy twice, and the Odyssey goes harder than it has any right to. But things like classic literature set the bar for the creative world, and it's why it's studied as rigorously as it is. Those tropes and memes, yeah, I know the actual word's definition, let me flex for fuck's sake, are important because they laid the foundations of what works and what doesn't, at least for literature. I mean, Tolkien isn't studied because of the Peter Jackson films or because black metal bands would hijack names from the books. No, Tolkien was a masterful writer who revolutionized the fantasy genre and put a lot of passion and soul into his own original work. I have zero interest in anything post-mortem because so much of modern Tolkien-based works rely on selling to the fantasy hack-and-slash crowd, and that's cool and all, but why I like Tolkien's work is his integration of world building, poetry, history, and the themes of anti-war, inner strength, and nature versus man. You know, I love the Peter Jackson trilogy of films. It's one of the few film series that I've actually seen in theaters and own. I love it that much, but, you know, and I'm gonna get a lot of shit for this, I love the Ralph Bakshi version even more. I can hear the mouth-breathing shutting going, but Ralph Bakshi made racist films with sexist characters and loved to draw women with large breasts. Yeah, big fucking whoop, that was over 50 fucking years ago, who cares? The art is gorgeous for this film, and it has this dark fantasy vibe mixed with its own sort of thing, and that's what I picture in my mind when I'm reading the books. The characters speak damn near identical passages from the novels, and everything is played pretty straight-faced and slow-paced, like the novels. Shit, dude, laugh all you want, but the Rankin Bass Hobbit and Return of the King films are in the same vein. Not as mature and foreboding as Bakshi's work, but they engage more into the literary side that Tolkien had in mind, even using songs and poems ripped straight from the novels, and they just feel cozy to watch, you know? Why would I want more when what I have is good enough, right? Maybe I'm just too jaded, but I wish people had this idea that something is just done, you know? I don't want a Silent Hill 2 remake. I don't even know why anyone in the fucking first place wanted one. I don't know why people insist that there needs to be a new thing every single day, all the time, and if that new thing doesn't exist in that very moment, reboot it so it stays relevant. What's the point? I know it's money, I'm not that stupid, you smarmy jackass. I just wish people could just sort of accept that Silent Hill, as it is kind of dead. Yeah, I know. But Seth, there was this thing with Hideo Kojima. Well, guess what? 1, it didn't happen. 2, Kojima is a great developer, but his name doesn't always mean success. 3, it didn't happen. 4, it was just a hype product. 5, it didn't fucking happen. Make your peace with the fact that some things just didn't happen. It's like when people bring up Chris Farley voicing Shrek. His line takes weren't that good. Chris Farley is dead. Move on. It's fun to play pretend or what if, but you know, there's a point in time where you have to accept things for what they are. Like the Star Wars fanfiction fuckfest that is the, God, I hate to use these words, sequel trilogy. I wish the Silent Hill franchise was as solid as the first 3 games, I really do, but 2 is just, it's as good as it gets. I've played it over a dozen times, and you know what, I'll likely play it a dozen more times and it'll never get old, because I'll find something interesting or cool I didn't notice before, or just enjoy the game for what it is. I have a lot of games I come back to out of this sense of comfort, whether it be for their story, their art, their music, gameplay, or a combination of all those things. Games like Doom, Crash 2, Daggerfall, Half-Life, or Dark Souls 1. If you notice something about some of those games, you'll also notice that it's either the first or second game in a series because, just like with Silent Hill, I don't want to wade through bullshit out of some sense of completion like a fucking Funko Pop display. No, I saved that for the Army Men series, you know me. No, I think some experiences are so solid and memorable, with so much to talk about, that it's almost unfair that I can't enjoy later titles. I have zero interest in anything to do with 3D Metroid titles or games with the dreaded M word attached to them. Metroid is a 2D game for me, and my experience with it is that forever, unfortunately. Mortal Kombat is a series that shot itself in the foot and turned me away, so now I just enjoy homebrews like MKP for the dedication and love put into those projects. Doom seems to have evolved with the times pretty well and made its own mark, but I am more interested in coding and creating my own levels for classic Doom, and I love working with creative limitations. Silent Hill 2 is, I'd hesitate to say perfect, but it kind of is. It handles very real and taboo subjects very seriously, and is a great way of visualizing concepts and emotions that mere words can't describe. I've waxed him before, but Max Darrett, the absolute unit, He actually suggests an idea that video games like Silent Hill 2 should be used as educational learning tools for the future, and I totally agree. Yeah, I know, I can see you rolling your eyes at the idea, but what's the difference between reading something like Fahrenheit 451 for a dystopian book project, or listening to Mozart in a music class? Or watching Begotten for human anatomy courses? I wish heavy metal was dissected more as a music class because the sheer complexity of musical skill required to write songs like Lateralis by Tool, Fistful of Steel by Rage Against the Machine, or Miasma by Ghost. It's impressive, man, and it doesn't get talked about enough. I wish films like TCM, Eraserhead, or Inglourious Basterds were used in discussing how to create interesting camera angles, theming, or how to create tension in a film. I think games like Half-Life and Silent Hill 2 and Super Metroid are easily some of the most important games of all time, and their design is important to study because of how they affected the gaming industry as a whole. The problem with culture in my mind, and this is going to come off as a bit callous and edgy, but consider everything I've said in this entire retrospective. We can't just accept that we live in a gross, nasty world with nasty things. We can't accept that the macabre, dark, and disturbed reality we live in is real. And there are individuals among us, like me, who fully accept and embrace that reality. Things like Silent Hill 2 are painful, yes, but you know what? Pain and discomfort is a process of healing, and avoiding things simply because they're yucky or icky, it's weird to me. Obviously, I'm not stupid. You don't show an 8-year-old Silent Hill 2 when they ask you what it's like to be depressed. That's a bad idea waiting to happen. You can use examples from Silent Hill 2 to describe depression, but at the same time, you should also not rely on just things like consumable media to solve and explain away very real issues. I don't believe in shit like showing a white supremacist Schindler's List or like American History X and expecting them to just drop all their preconceived hatred and fears. I don't think that works. It's like how I don't think that making everyone in marketing ads black somehow will just magically solve all racial tensions in America. It just doesn't work that way. There's only so much media can influence, and I pray it stays that way forever, because media should be interpreted and scrutinized, and your conclusions from it should be personal and impactful, and it's only stuff based on your own opinions. It's why I get so fucking disgusted and weirded out by binge culture or this idea that everything should be collected and consumed at a rapid-fire pace with little retention, with very stringent and narrow mindsets. The ultimate goal is, what? To spit out trite repeated memes and garbage that contributes nothing to art, academia, or culture, and just say go nowhere statements like, I liked it, or it just needs remade. It's like how I fucking hate people that use TLDR unironically or just absorb shit from wikis, because it just shows this overall decay in critical thinking skills as well as social skills, and leads to people falling into lazy and shitty habits. When people say shit like, Daddy Longlegs are the most poisonous spiders in the world, I'm gonna call you out because you're too stupid to know what the difference between poison and venom is, and you don't know a goddamn thing about spiders, period. When people say, yeah, PTSD sounds awful, but you weren't in like a war or something, I want to ask them if they genuinely think that only military service members are people that experience violent shock or trauma out of the billions of people on the planet. If I had one wish for the future, it would be for public education to understand and educate the youth of the future on the minds of the mentally ill and how we see the world. I wish that we as a species tried to help those in pain and not placate to their problems just out of some sense of, well, it's their choice. Because clearly that hasn't helped us in the past few thousand years, now has it? You know what helped my life? Realizing that I was a selfish and self-destructive person and harming those around me because of my inability to want to help myself. I expected everyone to bow to me because I had it bad, and that's exactly the worst thing to possibly do. It took me nearly getting killed at 25 after a breakup by an oncoming drunk driver to realize that the last words I would have said to my best friend were, I don't fucking care anymore if I live or die. I'm better off dead because all I do is fuck things up for everyone. That would have been the last things they had heard me say if I had died, and they would have had to live with that forever. It took my boss and building manager sitting me down and telling me to take time off and to stop living in fear and paranoia to make me realize that I had lost sight of what made me happy. It took years of therapy and medication and thousands of hours of introspection and reality checking to get where I am today. And you know what? If I continued to do things my way, I'd be incomprehensible, I'd be totally vacant, I'd see the world in such an even more twisted way, and I'm sure I wouldn't have lived past 20. Games like Silent Hill 2 are important because they demonstrate what letting people do things their way can do to someone. It destroys them, day by day, and leads to psychosis and delusion. We see it all the time in every part of the world. Someone who's mentally ill doesn't get the proper intervention or help, they do something desperate or get dangerous, and people who knew them never seem to do a damn thing to stop them, and there's always about 50 different red flags that seem to go unnoticed. I'm not saying we should all live in some police state where writing edgy poetry is punishable by a week-long isolation in a mental ward. Nah. But there has to be a point where people can get help properly through a legal, humane, and tax-funded program. It would make use of all those useless degrees my generation seems to possess, and it would drastically reduce things like mass shootings, suicide, self-harm, existential breakdowns, and health issues from stress and fatigue. I mean, I believe in individuality, self-expression, and freedom of choice, but there comes a point where people genuinely need help. And it shouldn't be a volunteer-based thing, especially if you have some kid who's drawing the words, "I want to die," over and over on his notebook and not talking to anybody, or you have some guy who writes rape fantasies about women he sees in the gym and then posts them to his TikTok, never blinking or emoting while he reads them. Those people need help. They don't just deserve help, they need help, forcibly and quickly to prevent damage or a loss of life. Also, something I wish socially everybody could understand is some people, they can't be helped. I've seen it too often in my own life, and you know, it's just a sad, cruel part of the world. Even with all my wishful thinking of forced help to the mentally ill, it doesn't stop abuse. It doesn't stop suicide or homelessness or violence. It's just, unfortunately, inevitable. Some pain is beyond repair, and that can break people. I mean, it almost happened to me, and it took a lot of effort to steer myself in the right direction. And I've known people who've killed themselves or became addicts or homeless or abused their kids, and it breaks my heart, especially if I'd known them since school. I still, to this very day, struggle to think that the last physical conversations I had with one of my best friends was negative before he dropped out. We talked online after high school, and it was all positive, but he died in a military accident before he was even 20, and I feel like his life was cut so short, and he didn't deserve the fucking life he was given before because he barely had time to live. And I still feel like I could have reached out even more in high school just to keep him from dropping out and to avoid him from joining the military, but I did everything I could, and I can't change that. I know my final conversation with him online was good, and his choices were his own in life, and it wasn't my place to tell him what he should do with his future. I think of a friend I had in high school who I told the reality of his plan to somehow just move to Japan and become a manga artist with zero money and experience. And he had a total breakdown after that, and I feel like it was my fault. Like, if I had taken back that reality check that I thought was an act of trying to make him see reason, he'd get a grip. Maybe we'd still be friends, but I don't know. I know I did everything I could, and his descent further into nihilism and self-destruction was far from my fault, and was building up for years before we even met. There really is an aspect of Silent Hill 2's story concerning James that resonates with people like me and many others who've experienced guilt from their actions, whether they be extreme or minor, and I've really not seen any other game or media since paint that picture so clearly. The last half hour or so of SH2 was such an emotional roller coaster because everything up to that point has been hinting, prodding, and trying to show the player what James has done, and also beautifully integrates the player-to-player character relationship for the big ultimate conclusions. you really feel like you went on James's journey through the hell of his mind and the hell of the town itself. You really feel like your preconceived thoughts on James can be shaped by his revelations as they happen to him as well. You really feel like you earned the ending you worked towards just as much as James did. I really haven't played many games that can make me feel towards a little pile of pixels because of how real and mature the story is. We see it in games and film all the time that characters are meant to either be likable or unlikable, based on the way they're written and directed, but in my mind as a writer, a good character is one who feels like they can be interpreted in different lights by different types of people. I can't stand this current trend of making a sympathetic villain who somehow has to be saved or relatable. Real life isn't like that. People can change, yeah, but someone like James would be considered a villain in the eyes of the law, and the general public. The fact I feel actually bad for him because he was pushed too far for too long, and I can empathize with him in a way that wasn't forced on me through a monologue of awkward exposition, that's what good writing is. Subtlety and just the right amount of vagueness for enough room for interpretation can create a truly timeless character because it makes them feel that much more real. Like, the only characters I can think of off the top of my head writing this that even come close to that level of interpretation are characters like Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver, Joshua Graham from New Vegas, or Walter White from Breaking Bad. All of these characters have committed or planned horrible acts, but their raw and primal instincts of survival, extremity through circumstance, and want for some real sense of redemption have a long-lasting impression on me as a viewer, and many others as well, because of how well they're handled. Someone like Darth Vader is a poor villain in my eyes because of how overly complex and unreal his struggles are. He literally was a cocky, arrogant asshole from the start of the prequels, and his quest for redemption is so convoluted and fleshed out through supplementary materials that by the time he kills the Emperor, it's like, okay, somehow that one act makes all the bad he did okay? Order and balance of the Force my ass, all he did was create a power vacuum. Someone like Anton Chigurh is somewhat of an unreal villain to me, and I like No Country for Old Men, and the cinematography is pretty good, and the undertones of the world moving on from the hero sheriff days is pretty cool, but I feel that he's almost too capable and unstoppable, like a horror film monster, more than just a man on a mission. Don't give me that Scar is the greatest, bestest villain ever bullshit either, because that's reaching for straws in a fucking drawer full of razor blades, man, and when you're ready to act like a grown-up, you better bring something more realistic than the mean brown lion to discuss on morality, philosophy, and character analysis. But all mean jabs aside, I think that's as much as I really want to talk about Silent Hill 2 for, like, ever. And maybe you can see what I mean after all this. Silent Hill 2 isn't what I used to process all these emotions and experiences in my life, but it allowed me the ability to know how to reflect on what I was taught in my years of therapy and healing. It was something I kept close in my heart when I first saw it when I was very young because I knew it meant something special to me in that moment, and maybe even for the future. Very few games will ever compare. I'm sorry, it's unfair to say, but it's true. Because, you know, as edgy as it sounds, in filth, it will be found. And I hope, I really do, someday, we can all see what that truly means. Thanks for watching.